Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of Tracing Jewish Histories. Our topics today are collection and display, both private and in museums. And Reed and I would just like to once again thank our supporters of the conference, Sam Fogg, the Mellon Foundation, and Case Western Reserve University, as well as the organizers in the Research Forum and our advisors reports, Tom Nixon, Alina Gertzman, and Alex Bovey. Oh, and the Medieval Academy of America, last but not least. Just one quick thing. The panels are being recorded, and the microphones are kind of scattered about the room, and sometimes pick up little snippets of conversation. So if you want to tell your deepest, darkest secrets, please do so in the hallway. Just be aware. And so without further ado, we will bring up Olga Mogaluk to introduce the first session.
Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce session 4, Collecting Practices at Large, and our speakers today. I'm Olga Mogaluk, a former student here at the Courtauld. What a joy to be back, and what a treat. Tess Artis, a graduate student of art history at Case Western Reserve University, will chair this session. And thank you, Laura and Reed, for the invite. As the name suggests, this session will examine the history of both private and institutional collecting, analyzing the trends that shaped the assembly of large collections of Judaica and medieval objects, as well as the legal and practical issues involved in tracing the provenance and ownership of such works. I will introduce each speaker before their presentation, and we will leave all the questions for the end. Our first speaker is William Diebold, who will present his paper, The Darmstadt Haggadahs to Volent, 1950s. William is a Jane Neuberger Goodsell Professor of Art History and Humanities, emeritus at Reed College. He has published extensively on early medieval topics, including his book Word and Image, an introduction to early medieval art, and articles on Carolinian and Attonian manuscripts, ivories, and writing about art. His more recent research on the modern reception of medieval art has led to publications such as Medieval Art, Modern Politics, which is co-edited with Brigitte Bübner. Please join me in welcoming William.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks, I'll join the line of thanks to Reed and Laura for organizing this and for the opportunity to speak here. The 20th century was on the whole good to this manuscript, the Darmstadt Haggadah. The book was, for example, the subject of 2 full facsimiles in the course of the century. But unsurprisingly for a Jewish manuscript held in a German public collection, the 20th century history of the Darmstadt Haggadah was also disrupted. This paper traces 2 of these disruptions, both of which took place in the 1950s. The first was the manuscript's recovery by the library in Darmstadt after it had been removed from that collection. The second reversed that process and involved attempts to remove the Haggadah from Darmstadt and indeed from Germany. This paper uses archival research to describe what happened to the Darmstadt Haggadah in the 1950s and why it might be significant. My conclusion, to begin with it, will not surprise. The course of modern German history, and especially attitudes towards Jews, was decisive in the history of the Darmstadt Haggadah. In the spring of 1943, the distinguished British historian of Judaism, Cecil Roth, convened a conference to discuss what should happen to Jewish cultural heritage in Germany when the Second World War ended, which was an event that was still 2 years in the future at the time. In his address to the gathering, Roth took it for granted that Germany must not be allowed to retain possession of the huge number of Jewish objects the Nazis had stolen. But he went further. That was not far enough. I'm not quite sure, however, that we should not go further than this. It seems to me that the German people has lost its right to any objects which have been used for anti-Semitic purposes, however acquired and however long possessed. That the beautiful Darmstadt Haggadah should find its way back into showcases after having been kept in obscurity, lest its beauty should induce visitors to revise their opinions regarding the Jews' lack of aesthetic sense, that seems to me to be contrary to nature. This passage, I think, is striking, or was striking to me, not least because of Roth's use of the powerful phrase contrary to nature to describe a cultural practice. But I find this passage interesting because when I read it, it was also obscure. To what is Roth referring? What happened to keep the Darmstadt Haggadah in obscurity under the Nazis? Roth here is pointing to a barely known and frankly bizarre episode in the Haggadah's modern history. The manuscript's transfer in 1942 from the library in Darmstadt, where it had been since very early in the 19th century, the manuscript's transfer to the German Leather Museum in Offenbach. Offenbach, like Darmstadt, lies close to Frankfurt. The two cities are less than 30 miles apart. Geographically, then, the move was not a serious one. Nor did the change of venue make the Haggadah less accessible. Indeed, the manuscript was on permanent display in Offenbach, which was not the case, so far as I know, when it was in the library in Darmstadt. Recall, however, that all this was happening in 1942. This was not an auspicious time in Germany to be exhibiting a medieval Haggadah. At the Leather Museum, the Darmstadt Haggadah was displayed closed, in keeping with the museum's wide sole interest in that book, which was its impressive cut leather binding. Roth in England apparently knew that only the manuscript's cover was being displayed, and he put an extremely negative construction on that fact. He attributed the display of the book closed to the desire of the Nazis to conceal evidence of Jewish visual creativity. Darmstadt was heavily bombed in World War II, and both the library's collection and its records were in disarray when the war ended. The Haggadah was a well-known manuscript, however, and inquiries about it began to arrive. Responding to such inquiries in 1949 and 1950, the library's director, Hans Rasp, had to admit that he didn't know where the manuscript was. It was only in February of 1951 that the Darmstadt Library discovered that the Haggadah was in Offenbach at the Leather Museum. Almost immediately, the library requested the manuscript's return. With this request, which is a piece of museum business as usual, the potentially tragic story of the Darmstadt Haggadah during and after the Nazis slowly turned in the direction of farce. It would take 2 full years for the Haggadah to make the short trip back to Darmstadt from Offenbach, as the dispute between the Leather Museum and the Darmstadt Library would rise through the government of the German state of Hesse. Both Darmstadt and Offenbach lie in Hesse, and ultimately the dispute would reach Hesse's cabinet and its minister president. Although the archival record is extremely extensive, albeit dispersed, and it appears to be complete, the length and vehemence of this dispute is puzzling, or it's puzzling to me. I believe that part of the puzzlement comes from the fact that anything in Germany in the 1950s having to do with Jews was extremely fraught, and so obfuscation rather than frankness rules in the documents. There's no doubt that the major stumbling block to the Haggadah's return was this man, the Leather Museum's director, Hugo Eberhardt. Eberhardt simply refused to give the manuscript up on the grounds that the Haggadah was transferred to the Leather Museum in 1942 as a Dauerleihgabe, a long-term or permanent loan. Eberhardt put exceptional weight on the first part of that word, Dauer, while the library in Darmstadt pointed to the second part and noted that loans can be revoked. It's not entirely clear to me why Eberhardt was so insistent on reading Dauerleihgabe literally, or emphasizing the first part. Roth thought that Eberhardt's motive was that he was a Nazi and that he did not want to acknowledge Jewish cultural production. Roth's argument is certainly possible. Eberhardt was a Nazi, and he was also at least a casual anti-Semite, as we know from some of his writings. But perhaps just as important, Eberhardt was truly obsessed with leather. Rasp, obviously there's a not antithetical. Rasp, the director of the Darmstadt Library, frequently referred to him in his correspondence as Lederhart, tough as leather, a pun on his name, his fanatical devotion to leather, and his dogged personality. Nazi or not, Eberhard seems genuinely to have found the leather cover of the Darmstadt Haggadah more important than its text or pictures. Indeed, Eberhard wrote that it was he who had liberated the Darmstadt Haggadah from the sad slumber of sleeping beauty in which it had been lying in Darmstadt until he, the Prince Charming of leather, awoke the Jewish manuscript in order to display its cover. This is not the place to go into the details of the Darmstadt Library's efforts to get the Haggadah back. The process was bizarrely complicated, thanks to Eberhard's intransigence and some bureaucratic quirks in the organization of Hesse's government. That a Jewish manuscript was involved was a significant further complication, because it meant that the weird German mix of attitudes towards Jews that defined the early 1950s came into play. And as I understand that mix, it combined residual anti-Semitism with its guilt-ridden counterpart, philo-Semitism. And then both were further complicated by a more or less complete ignorance about Jews and Judaism. If Jews were a fraught and cryptic subject in Germany in the early 1950s, Nazis were equally fraught, but not at all cryptic. The Darmstadt librarians and their allies thus had no qualms about portraying Eberhard as a Nazi or his acquisition of the Haggadah as a Nazi action, and here they were on quite firm ground. 1942, the same year that the Haggadah was transferred from Darmstadt to Offenbach, that same year, 1942, saw the Leather Museum celebrate its 25th anniversary. This was the occasion for Eberhard's decision to join the Nazi Party, and also for the government of Hesse to facilitate the loan of the Haggadah from Darmstadt to Offenbach. As part of the celebrations, a Festschrift was produced, which showed that the Leather Museum had, like virtually every other institution in the Third Reich, been brought fully into the Nazi orbit. And after the war, the Darmstadt librarians were careful to point this out to the politicians in post-war Hesse. They repeatedly sent them excerpts from the Festschrift in order to make clear what Eberhard's politics were. At the same time that the Darmstadt Library was pressing the case that Eberhard was a Nazi, they were also emphasizing the Jewish aspects of the manuscript. Rasp, the library director, got Hans Eppelsheimer, who was the director of the Frankfurt Library, to support his case. Eppelsheimer himself was not Jewish, but he had been married to a Jew. Given the lack of familiarity with things Jewish in this era in Germany's history, this gave Eppelsheimer a certain authority with the politicians. In a letter to Hesse's interior minister, Eppelsheimer expressed his shock at seeing a unique work of book art belittled by being reduced to its binding. He called the Haggadah a monument of Jewish religion, whose allocation to a leather museum must be regarded as an anti-Semitic action. Even more scathing was a Protestant professor of theology who decried that by being displayed as leather paraphernalia, treasures were desecrated and an important Jewish ritual object was defiled. These strong words from Gentiles were seconded by Jewish groups, which the Hesse cabinet consulted before making its decision about where the book should go. According to Hesse's state rabbi, the Jewish community would regard it as an insult to their religious sensibilities if the Haggadah remained in the Leather Museum on account of its binding. These Jewish opinions, rather than any of the more normal legal arguments about ownership, carried the day with the politicians, who finally decided after several years that the Haggadah should go back to Darmstadt. When Hesse's labor minister gave Eberhard that bad news, he explained that the cabinet's decision was especially grounded in the fact that the Jewish community felt offended in their religious sentiments by the display of the Passover Haggadah for its binding. The cabinet of Hesse could not ignore these objections. This protracted saga finally came to an end on January 28, 1953, when Offenbach sent the Haggadah to Darmstadt by courier. The return of the Haggadah to its longtime owner after a decade on loan should have been museum business as usual. But in the fraught world of post-war Germany, such a dispute, when it involved a Jewish object, was anything but business as usual. The importance of the manuscript's return was certainly recognized by the Central Council of Jews of Germany, who after the book went back to Darmstadt, thanked the Hesse Education Ministry for correcting a Nazi despotic measure. So I think that this shows to some degree the high level at which this argument was taking place in terms of ideology. So the return of the Haggadah to the Darmstadt Library in early 1953 was not the end of the manuscript's turbulent 1950s. Less than 2 years later, Library Director Rasp received a letter from an American law firm representing a group of Jewish clients interested in placing the Darmstadt Haggadah in an American public collection, and they proposed exchanging the Haggadah for other manuscripts. On the face of it, this seems a fool's errand. Darmstadt had just barely gotten the Haggadah, which is one of its treasures, back. Nevertheless, the library pursued the possibility of an exchange for 2 full years, so through all of 1954 and 1955. The American clients were a group called the American Congregation of Jews from Austria. How this small and obscure New York association came to be interested in the Darmstadt Haggadah is unclear. Their motives, however, were clear. According to the group's president, an exchange of the Haggadah would be interpreted not only on the part of American Jews, but of the American public as a whole, as a most generous gesture and one which would be in keeping with other German restitutory action. The Darmstadt Haggadah, deposited in an American Jewish institution, would be an effective symbol of the spirit of restitution. What the American Jews had to offer in exchange for the Haggadah were these 2 late medieval manuscripts. Neither was as famous as the Haggadah, but they were not insignificant. On the left is a densely illuminated copy of a 15th century chronicle, and on the right an illustrated survey of the Emperor Maximilian's armory, painted in the first years of the 16th century. The American group was working with a German agent, a Darmstadt art dealer named Karl Böhming. Böhming pumped up the importance of the manuscripts on the screen and asserted that the Haggadah should be of little interest to the library in Darmstadt because it was Jewish and there had already been a facsimile made of it. As he wrote to the library director Rasp, "It's significantly more important to own 2 valuable German manuscripts than a Jewish manuscript of which there's already an excellent reproduction." I cite this rather crass statement verbatim because it's entirely characteristic of its era, especially in its notion that a Haggadah made in Germany in the 15th century was a Jewish manuscript, while the two other coeval manuscripts, also written in the Empire, were German, and so of more value to a German library. Such a perception was common. The Darmstadt librarian Rasp, also a creature of his age, was not exempt from it. But Rasp's artistic standards were higher, and he was a more careful writer. When asked about the possibility of trading away the Darmstadt Haggadah, Rasp wrote, "The only possible compensation would be a treasure like the Manesse manuscript, that is as important for German culture as the Darmstadt Haggadah is for Judaism, if one doesn't want to count the Haggadah, made on German soil and within the German Jewish community, as a German cultural artifact." Precisely this last point, the one in the apologetic parenthesis, the question of whether the Darmstadt Haggadah was German or Jewish, turned out to be crucial in the manuscript's fate in the coming years. That question might appear a bit silly from our perspective, but it wasn't at the time. There was a long-standing German tradition of considering Jewish and German to be incompatible terms. That belief was fatally espoused by the Nazis, but it long preceded them. It also survived them. Thus, Böhming in the 1950s could argue that Darmstadt would be better off if the Haggadah were exchanged for 2 German manuscripts. Eppelsheimer, the director of the Frankfurt Library, whom we encountered earlier, was also drawn into this dispute, and he addressed this argument directly. The cultural bureaucrats in Hesse asked his opinion of the proposed exchange, and he wrote, "There's no doubt that the Passover Haggadah is a German national monument. It's not just a Hebrew text, but a piece of Judaica, a witness to Jewish culture in Germany." Ideas about Jews and Judaism that had a powerful resonance in post-war Germany also underpinned a second argument that was put forward for keeping the Haggadah in Darmstadt. It was asserted that the Haggadah was not just a museum object, but a living piece of Jewish religion and culture, a culture that was now almost entirely lost in Germany. Another librarian, also opposing the exchange, noted that Rasp had told him that about 20 Jews had gathered during Passover the previous year to recite from the Haggadah. And I think that fact was powerful because it resonated with the idea that Judaism is primarily a religion and that Jews are united because of their religious beliefs. These were compelling ideas in post-war Germany, ones with roots going back to Enlightenment-era German ideas about religious choice, ideas that constructed Jews as a faith community of German citizens. Those ideas regained popularity in the 1950s because they stood in stark and precise opposition to the Nazi construction of Jews as a race rather than a religion, and as a race that was not German. This attempt in the 1950s to reassert Enlightenment beliefs was at least partially successful. The Culture Ministry of Hesse was convinced by Eppelsheimer's statement about the Haggadah. It rejected the exchange of the manuscript because we are dealing here with a piece of German cultural property. But the old habits of thought, the ones that stumbled when they tried to understand German and Jewish as compatible words, not antithetical ones, those habits died hard. When the ministry wrote to the American lawyers to explain why they refused the exchange, their phrasing was clumsy. We have to class the Haggadah, the Hebrew notwithstanding, as German cultural property. Made in Heidelberg, it represents a document of Jewish culture in Germany. The locution is awkward because the thoughts underlying the words are awkward. Note the parenthesis, the Hebrew notwithstanding, or the periphrasis, Jewish culture in Germany. Think the more normal, simple, and direct phrase would simply be German culture. These verbal stutters indicate that the Haggadah, even as it maintained its place in the Darmstadt Library, was still in some ways a foreign body in post-war German culture writ large. I want to end with a coda, another in the first time as tragedy, second time as farce vein. 20 years later, there was another attempt by a Jewish organization to get the Haggadah out of the hands of the Darmstadt Library. In 1974, Liebe Weingarten, an American Holocaust survivor living in Israel, wrote to the mayor of Karlsruhe, complaining that the Darmstadt Haggadah was still unfortunately in German possession. In her view, the Haggadah belongs to the City Museum of Jerusalem, or belongs in the City Museum of Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people. Weingarten's letter, it was sort of weird that it went to the mayor of Karlsruhe. Weingarten's letter eventually ended up in the Cultural Ministry of Hesse, and Erich Zimmermann, Rasp's successor as the director of the Darmstadt Library, prepared a detailed refutation of it. So far, we're on familiar ground. So the library rejects the exchange. But Germany in 1974 was a very different place from Germany in 1954. And I'm thinking here of events such as the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of the early 1960s or the 1968 student and social events. Thus, in 1974, Zimmermann was able to make explicit some ideas about Germans and Jews that had been difficult to express in the early 1950s. For example, Zimmermann rejected the transfer of the Darmstadt Haggadah to Israel because it would make final the irrational separation of Jewish from German that was begun by the Nazis. This is a clear and definitive formulation, one that stands in sharp contrast to the awkward phrases we just saw. But despite Zimmermann's optimistic clarity about the renewed German-Jewish symbiosis, the shadow of the Shoah was very much still present. In his response to Weingarten, Hesse's culture minister recounted in detail the history of the Darmstadt Haggadah and its long ties to Germany. But he ended his letter exceptionally harshly, in my opinion, and quite abruptly. He concluded, "Given all of this context, your request does not make any sense to me." That a German bureaucrat could tell a Holocaust survivor that a belief that a Jewish cultural treasure should not remain in post-Shoah Germany, the idea that he could use the phrase nonsensical, the idea that was nonsensical, indicates that there was still a very large gap in Germany between Jews and non-Jews. And that's certainly not news, but the story of the Darmstadt Haggadah may, I think, help us illustrate how familiar ideas affect in particular and perhaps unexpected ways our objects of study. So thank you.
Thank you so much, William, for this fascinating paper. Our next speaker is Avi Kornfeld with the paper The Rosa Gomperz Endowment, a Rethinking the Kaufman Collection of Illuminated Hebrew Manuscripts. Avi is Associate Professor of Art History and Jewish Studies at the City College of New York. She focuses on the intersections among Jewish, Christian, and Islamic art across the medieval Mediterranean. Her forthcoming book, Art of the Haggadah, 1350 to 1400, resituates 3 Hebrew illuminated manuscripts with the broader context of medieval art in the late 14th century Iberia. She received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University in 2013, and her research has won the support of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, the Rifkind Center for the Humanities and Arts at the City College of New York, the Mellon Foundation, and the Wexner Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Avi.
Thank you, Olga, for the introduction, and to Ravi and Laura for having me. The fonts totally changed between my computer and here, so it now has like a new vibe, which I think I hate and love. So enjoy. Also, there will be a lot of Hungarian harmed in this presentation. Language, I mean. I can read it fine, I cannot pronounce it. As you will also see, my title has slightly changed, which I will explain in a bit. Today, the Hungarian Academy of Sciences is home to a sizable collection of Hebrew manuscripts that once belonged to David Kaufman, renowned scholar, historiographer, and collector, and his wife, Irma Kaufman, née Gomperz. David taught Jewish history at the Budapest Rabbinical Seminary and published on diverse subjects, including Jewish art. Some say he's the first to even coin that phrase, Jewish art. Together, the Kaufmans amassed a sizable collection of manuscripts, incunabula, books, prints, pamphlets, and Geniza material. The nucleus of their collection once constituted the holdings of Marco Mortara, rabbi of Mantua and a central figure in the Wissenschaft and Judentum movement in Italy, and the Trieste family in Padua. Many more books came from booksellers including Mordechai or Moritz Edelman in Jerusalem, Raphael Rabinovich in Munich, and Giuseppe Giade in Ferrara. After David and Irma died, their library was donated by Irma's mother, Rosa Gomperz, to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences on December 24, 1905, together with the cabinets in which they were kept in the Kaufman's home as the David and Irma Kaufman Foundation. And that's actually the box that is highlighted in purple. The second box, to this foundation, Rosa added, on her part, 25 richly illuminated manuscripts on parchment of excellent value from an art historical point of view, which are to be kept in a manner commensurate with their value. That means not in the cases in the Kaufman home. These manuscripts are to be known as the Rosa Gomperz Foundation. The Academy thanked her for her generosity and promised to faithfully preserve the memory of its distinguished owners. While much has been written on individual manuscripts in this collection, little, if anything, has been said of the roles of the Gomperz women in its creation, cultivation, donation, and legacy. None of the extant scholarship on the illuminated manuscripts refers to them as part of the Rosa Gomperz Endowment or Foundation. In my paper this morning, I will use archival sources to center the contributions of Irma Gomperz Kaufman and her mother, Rosa Gomperz. I will conclude with a plea that all future scholarship on these manuscripts, and most particularly the illuminated manuscript, should always refer to them as part of the Kaufman-Gomperz collection, or even, to be more correct, the Gomperz collection at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. David Kaufman built his library with the financial backing of his wife, Irma. She was the only child of affluent parents, affording Kaufman, in his words, the extraordinary happiness of financial independence. As George Kohut put it in an obituary to Kaufman, quote, blessed with ample means since his marriage to the daughter of Sigmund Gompers in Budapest, Kaufman was in a position to gratify every whim and indulge his literary passion unhampered, for he had only spiritual children to delight his heart. He was constantly buying books and manuscripts. He purchased the magnificent collection of Marco Mortara, one of the choicest private libraries on the continent. In a private diary entry, Ignaz Goldziher, one of Kaufman's good friends, I should say, bitterly asserted that Kaufman only married Gompers because she stood to inherit a sizable fortune. He writes, everything about Kaufman was hypocrisy, deceit, notoriety, calculation, and financial speculation. His character culminated in his marriage to a surviving spinster from a completely un-Jewish home. She had the advantage of being the heiress to $500,000. To appease the gods, all the dishes were destroyed and replaced with quote-unquote kosher items. While there's no doubt that Kaufman benefited from access to her family's wealth, it's my contention that both Irma and her mother, Rosa, were instrumental collaborators in cultivating the collection and ultimately ensuring its legacy. When David first met Irma in January 1881, he immediately recognized that she had the heart and education to join him on all his endeavors. He was impressed with her ability to enthusiastically follow everything he did, so much so that she could comment on his work. He appreciated her, quote, innate effervescent talents and her passion for writing. David Heinrich Müller, Kaufman's longtime friend and collaborator, remarked on Irma's education and her keen interest in his scientific work, which David so needed. That's Müller's words. Ferdinand Rosenthal, Kaufman's brother-in-law, spoke of Irma as intellectually gifted, cultured, and noble-minded, someone who valued intellectual creation above all else. The couple wed on April 10, 1881, and honeymooned in Italy. Just before their departure, Kaufman confided in his friend and mentor Leopold Zunz that he was concerned the trip would be difficult because he would not have the opportunity to immerse himself in Italy's manuscript treasures. Upon his return to Budapest, David happily reported back that his knowledgeable wife had encouraged him to visit private libraries in Italy and to spend time with their artistic treasures. He looked forward to a return trip to Italy with Irma and noted in his letter in 1881 that private collections were being rapidly devoured by traveling scholars, booksellers, and his word, book-savvy schnorrers. Soon after returning from their honeymoon, the Kaufmans began collecting. Irma was a key contributor in the development of their manuscripts collection, so much so that in a letter to Abraham Berliner dated March 30, 1885, David stated that his wife supported some areas of his collecting more than others. In particular, he wished she were more partial to the, quote, Egyptian business, likely a reference to his desire to build his collection from Genizas in Egypt. Instead, it appears that Irma was more interested in collecting works from Italy. To commemorate their 4th anniversary, Irma gifted David a Roman Mahzor printed in 1540 with glosses and extensive marginalia. Their biggest financial investment, however, came with the acquisition of the private library of the Trieste family in Padua. The Kaufmans purportedly paid 12,000 lira for the collection, which included 50 manuscripts, which had a very epic saga in how they made it from Italy to Budapest. In 1895, 10 crates of books and manuscripts from this collection were shipped to the Kaufmans. However, their export was blocked after 26 manuscripts were deemed too important to leave Italy. Only with the help of the highest-ranking official of the Lorenziana were the manuscripts permitted to leave, arriving in Budapest on February 28, 1896, after a year-long saga. David was writing weekly letters to his home for the whole year and kept his parents involved in every step of this journey. And after returning from the customs office on February 28, 1896, with the books finally in hand, he wrote that he was very much looking forward to returning to Italy with Irma, and in particular to thank Margulies in Florence, who had helped with their export. But he worried that the 8-day journey would be too arduous, as both he and Irma faced significant health issues. Just 3 years later, David died at the age of 47. After David's death, Irma dedicated herself to furthering his work and his legacy. She established a foundation at the Rabbinical Seminary to support scientific research. She provided pertinent materials and funding for Kaufman's memorial volume on the screen, a book described as, quote, by the newspapers, a monument worthy of the man it's intended to commemorate. She penned the volume's preface and gave her own suggestions as to who and what should be included. When the book was published, she took it upon herself to send copies to all of Kaufman's friends, colleagues, and relevant institutions, and even wrote letters to Ignaz Goldziher asking his advice to make sure she had not missed anyone. The local paper remarked that Irma published her husband's manuscripts with so much knowledge, enthusiasm, and love. In January 1902, she reached out to Max Freudenthal to ask if he would be willing to complete Kaufmann's monograph on the Gomperz family. In her letter, she described completing his work as her doubly sacred duty, since it was on her family's history and it was her husband's work. Freudenthal described her devotion to the project as though it were her, quote, biological child. She sent him questions, doubts, hopes. She specified that he must clearly designate places in the text where he inserted his own ideas. He noted that his broad progress brought her great joy, but his challenges, suspected or experienced, in bringing the manuscript to fruition would cause her physical and mental anguish. Irma was determined to honor Kaufmann's scholarly legacy by sharing his contributions as widely as possible. She sought out David Mueller and Marcus Brann as editors of what was intended to be a 4-volume compilation of Kaufmann's publications, many of which were published in difficult-to-access journals. In his preface to the first volume, Brann wrote that after Kaufmann's death, Irma's sole mission was to collect the scattered pearls of her husband's intellectual treasures and unite them for posterity. Indeed, in a letter penned on June 26, 1901, a jubilant Irma wrote that, quote, a weight had been lifted from her heart as she discovered the manuscript of the Morgenländischen, likely a reference to Kaufmann's article published in the Zeitschrift der Deutschen Morgenländischen Gesellschaft in 1895 in the last bookshop, and you can see she underlined Letzten up there. Although she did not live long enough to see this project to its completion, her indefatigable spirit and active participation were indisputable. Indeed, many scholars became acquainted with Kaufmann's work after his death in 1899, thanks to Irma's concerted efforts. In addition to cultivating his scholarly legacy, Irma continued to build their collection. She asked Samuel Krauss to look for manuscripts for her to purchase on his trip to Palestine. In April 1900, she purchased an illuminated 15th century manuscript, Kaufmann A361, to commemorate what would have been their wedding anniversary. And you can see here this manuscript has a whole complicated history. It was stolen and then wound up in the Berginsky collection without the front and endnotes, which actually originally said where they're from, which is why the two on either side are in microfilm, but the center is the actual book itself. She also acquired various other books, and here are some more, and the telltale sign that it was Irma that bought it, and this has never actually been pointed out about the collection, is that she always signed David Kaufmann, Budapest, but using English characters, or in German, versus Kaufman himself, who always signed his manuscripts in violet ink in Hebrew. And her handwriting matches all the letters that she's written too, so it's also clear from other ways as well. The manuscripts that she collected were often Italian illuminated manuscripts. To this, Irma also added 9 books that once belonged to the members of the Gomperz family. She also commissioned Miksa Weiss, one of Kaufman's students in the seminary and a close family friend, to produce a catalog raisonné as a loving memorial to her husband. Her hope was that the catalog would facilitate access to the collection. However, she did not live long enough to see its completion. Upon her death, Rosa Gomperz inherited the library as well as the many projects that Irma had been shepherding: the compilation of David's articles, the genealogical study of the Gomperz family, and the catalog raisonné. She took up these initiatives with gusto. In a letter to Wilhelm Stiasny, Rosa described this work as the sacred legacy of her glorified children, work which filled her with melancholy, satisfaction, consolation amidst her grief. She provided funds for each of the outstanding projects, and once each was complete, she worked hard to ensure maximum impact. For example, she sent 1,000 copies of each volume of Kaufmann's collected writings free of charge to the members of the Monate für Geschichte und Wissenschaft in Judentum. In addition to this work, Rosa made a series of charitable donations in accordance with Irma's wishes expressed during her lifetime. The largest monetary donation went to endow a scholarship in the name of Dr. David Kaufman and his wife, Irma Gomperz, at the Hungarian Jewish State Scholarship Fund. She also donated their artworks, to the Jewish Museum in Vienna, including the ones on the screen, as well as a seemingly now lost watercolor of the Jewish ghetto in Worms. By far her biggest donation, and the one that brings us here today, was the Kaufmann's Library. On December 24, 1905, Rosa Gomperz informed Albert Brzezowski, president of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, of her intention to donate the precious library. Her letter stated she believed that the intentions of the deceased would be best met by bequeathing the collection, together with the cabinets in which they were kept in the Kaufmann's home, to the Academy. In addition, she gave 25 manuscripts, true pearls of the visual arts that were, quote, her special property. Ignaz Goldziher extolled the virtues of this generous donation and outlined the contents and significance of the Kaufmann's enormous collection. At the end of his address to the Academy, he turned to Gomperz's manuscripts, which he described as having, quote, great value from an art historical rather than literary point of view. Those are just a few of them and a few images of them. For her charity, on December 6, 1906, Kaiser Franz Joseph I awarded her the Golden Crowned Cross. Her decision to donate the library to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences came as a shock to many who'd assumed the collection would be given to the Rabbinical Seminary of Budapest, where Kaufmann himself had worked for decades. As a result, there was much speculation, and these are just 4. There are like 50 newspaper articles about this. Within a week of her donation, a notice appeared in the Hungarian Jewish weekly, the Egyenlőség, Equality, claiming that Gomperz felt the Academy was, quote, the worthiest place for these precious treasures because she had concerns about the seminary library. Namely, that although it was home to an important collection of books and manuscripts, there was no librarian to manage its holdings. Instead, this task was purportedly left to students. This is a striking allegation because it was David Kaufman himself who had served as the seminary's librarian for 22 years. Seminary records indicate that it was actually Kaufman's colleague, Lajos Blau, who had taken over as librarian. And the article then goes on to say the seminary library had no reading room available to the public, nor the resources to make the books broadly accessible. Accordingly, the family decided that the Hungarian Academy of Science would make a more suitable home for the collection. Blau defended the library with a letter to the editor published 1 week later, clarifying the seminary has not 1 but 3 librarians and a reading room open most days. He continued, if the Gompers family's decision to donate the library to the academy was indeed motivated by dissatisfaction for the seminary library rather than enthusiasm for the academy, then they had been the victim of false information. This goes back and forth until April, when Blau's academic journal, the Magyartíró Szemlé, responded with allegations that David's heirs had sold off a great many books from the collection and given away off-prints, many of which bore his handwriting. Then Agent Loci defends the implication that the administrators of the fate of the Kaufmann Library had been negligent, highlighting that Irma had actually added to the collection. And I'll say also in a letter, Rosa actually had to apologize to Brand that she couldn't help him giving copies of David's writings because, in her words, Irma clings pathologically to everything that comprises the intellectual possessions of the deceased. So had she really sold them off? Seems unlikely. As for Rosa, the Viennese newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse, reported that when art connoisseurs had come to her with interest in purchasing the illuminated manuscripts, she decided not to separate the volumes, which constitute the library's greatest treasures, but to donate them along with the rest of the Kaufmann's library, so to not reduce the value of the entire library. Der Gemeindebote described her choice, however, as deeply lamentable, and went so far as to surmise that Rosa chose the academy because the seminary had no medals to bestow, a reference to the cross that she had received from the Kaiser. And I will just say, as I know I'm slightly running up against time, this argument goes on, and it continues even after the war. After World War II, this is an article from 1954 where they're still litigating this decision. But what I will say is that the consensus now, broadly, is that it turned out very lucky that the collection was donated to the Academy, because the Academy's collections actually survived mostly unscathed during the war. I mean, the library itself didn't, and the cabinets that were donated were destroyed. But the collection themselves, while the illuminated manuscripts were taken in the sack of Budapest, they were returned right after, where the seminary has never recovered more than 20,000 volumes that were taken from its holdings. Now, I want to end with the part where I began. Although I have now, throughout the library's catalog, the entries for the 25 illuminated scrolls and codices were marked with an asterisk and a footnote, Identitum der Frau Rosa Gompers, and I put it there in the bottom of the purple. Sometimes she's called Frau S for Sigmund, sometimes Rosa, or property of Mrs. R. Gompers. In the preface to the volume, Mixa Weiss wrote that these books and volumes, true pearls of the visual arts, were her special property. East von Ormos hypothesized that these books were not originally part of Kaufmann's library. Rather, they were owned by his mother-in-law because of financial reasons. Perhaps, as he's put it, they had to be acquired at such a high price that the old lady gave her consent on this condition alone. However, many of the manuscripts in her collection bear Kaufmann's inscriptions in his signature violet ink. And both of these, it's hard to see, in both he writes Kaniti, I bought this, and then says where and when he did so. And there are many examples of this. He also refers to them as meine zweibandigen Machzor-Handschrift. And in the Sarajevo Haggadah, the Kaufmann Haggadah is called der Kaufmannischen Haggadah. Sorry for my German pronunciation. Kaufmann's friends also reminisce about seeing all of his manuscripts. All evidence suggests that the illuminated manuscripts belonging to the Kaufmans during their lifetime, even if they were acquired with funds provided by his mother-in-law. By December 1905, however, a distinction is drawn between his library and the illuminated manuscripts. This is particularly noteworthy because by then Rosa had inherited the entire collection from Irma. The only explanation for this is that upon his death, David must have left Rosa the collection of the 25 illuminated manuscripts, leaving the rest of it to Irma. So then on Irma's death, Rosa gets all of it. While we cannot know precisely why he left her the collection of illuminated manuscripts, it's irrefutable that they belong to Gompers as much as Kaufmann. She donated them to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, much to the horror of many of the local community, and stipulated that they should be forever known as the Rosa Gompers Endowment, despite that she's rarely mentioned in connection with the collection, and if she is, it's only as the conduit through which the David Kaufmann Library came to the Academy. Yet it was her collection, which comprises the illuminated jewels in the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. To remedy this, I hope you will all join me in forevermore calling these the Kaufmann Gompers manuscripts or the Rosa Gompers Endowment. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Abby, for highlighting Rosa Gomper's role in shaping the Kaufmann collection. Our final speaker in this session is Anna-Lisa Kaplan, with her paper Accessible to All, The Unlimited Shelf Life of an Illuminated Mishneh Torah. Anna is a curator of the Jack, Joseph, and Mortimer Dell Wing for Jewish Art and Life at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Anna earned her master's degree in art history, specializing in Jewish art from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she studied also Hebrew codicology and paleography. Her unpublished thesis, the tripartite miscellany of Shabbatai ben Matatiah, Rome 1283, was supervised by Professor Sarit Shalivani. She recently curated the major exhibition Maimonides, A Legacy in Script, and is currently working on an exhibition for 2026, The Girl Who Wrote, Luna Ambrose Esther Scroll, which will showcase an Esther Scroll and blessing sheet scribed by 14-year-old Luna Ambrose in 1767 Rome. Floor is yours.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for this occasion. I'm very happy to be here with colleagues and teachers and many also new people that I met in this occasion. So let's start. We have a long journey in 20 minutes. I hope that we make it. And this is the last section, and so hope you make it. So Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, widely known as Maimonides, physician, scientist, philosopher, and most notably legal authority, completed his Mishneh Torah, the repetition of the Torah, between 1168 and 1178 in Muslim Egypt. Maimonides had settled there after a tumultuous journey fleeing radical Muslim persecutions in Andalusia, passing through Morocco and the land of Israel during the time of the Crusader kingdoms. In the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides organized the entire body of rabbinic literature, the Mishnah and Gemara, into 14 sections named books to make Jewish law and precepts accessible to communities from the Middle East to Europe, from the land of Israel to Yemen. His goal was to preserve the spiritual continuity of the Jewish people for future generations. To achieve this, Maimonides chose to write his work in Hebrew, the common language of Jewish people, rather than in his native Arabic, in which he wrote his other major works. He actively promoted the spread of his legacy, authorizing copies of his personal manuscript, which were adjusted and used as master copies for distribution. Already, sorry, I didn't pass it. This is, how do you do it? Sorry. This? That's it? Just this. Okay, sorry. So he actively promoted the spread of his legacy. authorizing copies of his personal manuscript, which were adjusted and used as master copies for distribution already in his time. We learned this from his own signed surviving authorized copy, and we see, sorry, we don't have time for all this, I had to cut, so the more important is the signature. It has been corrected from my own book, I, Moses, son of Rabbi Maimon, the righteous of blessed memory. The Mishneh Torah was since then widely disseminated across Jewish communities and remains the most comprehensive code of Jewish law ever created, still studied and referred to today. Nearly 300 years after its completion, another Moshe ben Yitzchak Hanav, commissioned a highly refined, richly illustrated copy of this great work, the focus of today's presentation. It is a sort of what I like to call melting pot of traditions, and we make a journey now throughout time and space to trace how it remained relevant to our days. Okay, just to show you how the actual look, because it's so annoying to see a flat image on the screen. We go back to this later. Okay, volume 1 is in the collection of the Vatican Library and comprises Maimonides' introduction to the work and book 1 to 5 with missing content at the end. The second volume is currently jointly owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art of New York and the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and comprises books 7 to 14, means that book 6 is completely missing. Let's start from the beginning. We are lucky because we have a colophon. It's very, very faded, very, very difficult to read all the parts, but what we can read from the colophon is that at the end of the manuscript, so means the last page of our jointly known volume with the Metropolitan, and it says that Nehemiah copied the codex for Moshe, Anav ben Isaac. This is something that I'm still having to understand. If it's Anav, like the Roman family, or Anav, like humble ben Isaac. I don't think he's from Rome, but we'll see later. He also highlighted his name in the first volume, Nehemiah, and the volume that is in the Vatican actually, and also, luckily, Nehemiah gave us the hint of a date. And at the end of the first book, the Book of Knowledge, he writes this note corresponding to the year 1457. So we don't know exactly when or where the work was completed. This proves that the date for the codex creation approximately. Nehemiah did not sign other manuscripts apparently, nor has his hand been definitely identified as aware. Needs more research. However, it is clear that he was a skilled scribe in page layout design, as many skilled scribes, and we saw many of those in these days. He wrote the opening words in large bold letters, which were later covered in burnished gold leaf, leaving space for decorative elements. In some cases, he didn't do that. It's also something that sometimes happens in even such beautiful manuscripts. For example, the Book of Kedusha is completely left without decoration. Another one of the panels in our volume, and while in this case on your right, you see that he had also some artistry skills, and you see that this is the only one that have really scribal work that shows a very nice artistry. We also try to go back to this a little later. But now we go back to the text. So furthermore, he skillfully integrated glosses and commentaries into the margins, known as Agot Maimonides and Teshuvot Maimonides, Maimonidean comments and responsa. These commentaries, compiled in the late 13th century by Rabbi Meir ben Yekutiel Cohen, a student of the Ashkenazi scholar Maharam Orotev, one of the most important scholars, are based on legal rulings from rabbis in France and Germany. Since the 14th century, these glosses and responsa were included in Ashkenazi copies of the Mishneh Torah to adapt Maimonides' work to the Ashkenazi halacha. We see here on the right this Mishneh Torah from Germany, middle 14th century. This is one of the notable examples, and we see this window style, window shaped, integrated in the text of the Mishneh Torah to adapt to help to guide the reading and the studying for the Ashkenazi public. Despite these Ashkenazi connections, the manuscript was created in Italy, as indicated by its distinctive artistic style. The medium of book illumination, with its rich use of gold leaf and intricate decorations, does more than beautify the text. It also adds a deeper layer of interpretation, bringing the legal content to life. The illustrations are not just ornamental, but are designed to vividly depict the laws and case studies discussed in the text. The iconography, tailored specifically for this codex, is unique and remains an innovative feature of this manuscript, providing vivid windows into Jewish ritual life and customs, and reflecting the spirit of the time. Outstanding are illustrations focusing, we don't have time for an art history lesson, so we go just to see the richness, and we go further just to see, I just cut some details to see how rich that one object is, so many topics. So here just focus on these two outstanding art illustrations, focusing on practical halacha, such as a thief caught in the act of housebreaking, found at the beginning of Sefer Nezikim, the Book of Injuries, and which address damages to property, personal injury, and the corresponding compensation. And in the same panel, you see a goring ox above on the top, which is also one of the issues discussed at the beginning of the book. And in the book of Kinyan of acquisition is also illustrated with scenes such as a sale of a horse and of a house, both representing transactions governed by Jewish law. Some images relate to laws that applied specifically during the time of the temple in Jerusalem. For example, the offering of the Passover sacrifice, along with the celebration of the Passover Seder. We see here also, we don't have time to go on the iconography, but this is Pesach Mitzrayim, because the people are standing, and it's people who knows that this can see the hints about that. So the manuscript also reflects a deep engagement with Maimonides' philosophical and theological ideas. The opening of Sefer Hamadah, the Book of Knowledge, the first of the 14 books, addresses the foundation of faith and religion, shows it in our manuscript, shows a group of astronomers equipped with measuring and calculating instruments like an astrolabe and compasses, gazing at the stars. The imagery aligns with Maimonides' opening discussion in Sefer Hamadah, which literally means the book of science, where he argues that an understanding of nature, especially the study of celestial bodies, is essential to grasping the essence of the divine. He writes that knowledge, or knowledge of God, is the first step toward comprehending the Creator. This stage is further developed in Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides' seminal philosophical work intended for a select audience of Jewish scholars who were not only well-versed in Jewish texts, but also in Greek and Arabic philosophy and science. In the guide, Maimonides emphasizes that the study of the natural world is the necessary precursor to understanding God. In fact, a similar depiction that we are seeing here, I skipped one slide, I think. A similar depiction appears in a unique 14th century illuminated manuscript of the God of the Perplexed you see on your left, produced in Barcelona in 1348. So it's more than a century before our Mishneh Torah, and in another place. The second part of guide opens, The second part of the God of the Perplexed from Spain, from Barcelona, opens with a depiction of scholars engaged in an astronomy lesson, gazing at the stars, a depiction that, like Maimonides' philosophy, with the practice, a depiction that links Maimonides' philosophy with the practice of celestial observations and means as a means to unlock divine knowledge. This Sephardic Okay. This Sephardi manuscript opens with an illustration of a teacher delivering his book to his pupil, possibly representing Maimonides and Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibon, the first who engaged in translating the Guide of the Perplexed into Hebrew in order to transmit it to non-Arabic speakers, fellows in Europe. In the lower level, we see the master teaching a group of students engaged in learning, and some of them has even a compass, so they engage in practical science. These two major representations, we saw here actually, these two major presentations in the Guide of the Perplexed reminds also the opening panels of our Mishneh Torah. One is the opening of the Book of Knowledge, and also the introduction to Maimonides, that is here on the right, from the first panel actually in our 2 volumes, 15th century Mishneh Torah, that sees the introduction and also a class of students learning from the teacher that is really on a high chair, the master, and this expressing the concept of the transmission of the oral Torah and of the importance of teaching and learning, a process that Maimonides describes in details in his introduction to the Mishneh Torah. The process of delivering of the knowledge is expressed in this case, so in these two very different manuscripts. One is the guide, one is the Mishneh Torah, but they have actually common proposal of delivering what Maimonides was very important. Even if the guide was only meant to be for a selected public, and the Maimonides actually was meant to be spread, but we see here an encounter of these two, to understanding of the later owner of the Mishneh Torah in Italy in 15th century had known about all this vibe of what Maimonides, what means to order Mishneh Torah in Italy in 15th century. Then we try to go back to this later. So the illustration of a Jewish legal codex in Italy did not emerge in a vacuum. It was influenced by the growing tradition of Christian canonical codes and legal manuscripts that accompanied the rise of universities in Western Europe, particularly the ancient University of Bologna. By the early 14th century, Bologna had become the world's leading center of law. As a result, illuminated legal manuscripts were primarily produced there and throughout Italy. And I just brought you here just one example. The Graziano Decretum is a very important codex. Actually, learning was produced in the 11th century, actually parallel to some sort of parallel what the time of Maimonides was trying to make this, to save the Jewish law in, even if it was in Muslim lands, but the Decreto Graziani, I'm sorry, I don't have time to go much in details, but is also a key work, canonical work, that was very much known in Europe, France and Italy for sure, because it was from Italy originally, and there were many, many illuminated copies of this work. This is one of that wanted to show you that this race of the time of the 14th century, and so the creation of legal manuscript received the same level of devotion and meticulous care as the production of theological work. I'm talking about the non-Jewish environment. So a parallel tradition of illuminated Jewish law codices developed in central Italy. One of the earliest surviving is, of course, the well-known Rabbi Isaiah Trani, that's actually attributed also to Bologna or Padua later, but let's say Bologna. And for our purpose of this conference, I want to focus on the Mishneh Torah that was produced in Spain or possibly in Provence. And after 1373, it made its way to Perugia in central Italy, where it was partially illuminated around 1400 in the workshop of the very famous artist Matteo di Sercambio. A gap of several decades follows before the creation. Is between these two copies. The one that today is in the National Library, and our 2 volumes, Mishneh Torah of 15th century. Although these 2 codices have different iconographic scheme and subject matters, both demonstrate an in-depth understanding of specific halachic topics. This suggests that Christian artists may have worked closely with the Jewish editor, possibly a collaboration between the patron and the scribe himself to shape the iconography, ensuring that it faithfully reflected Jewish legal concept. And this process required intricate coordination of different artists, a group of very skilled artists that likely were employed by nobility and clergy and economic elite of either Veneto and Lombardy, still to be defined. And this intricate coordination required to create an extensive decoration scheme I have to repeat. The intricate coordination required to create an extensive decoration scheme indicates a level of artistic collaboration that is still being studied as is the research into the identities of the artists and their main collaborators. So there's still work to do. How much? Okay. Among the artists suggested, so I had to run, so I had to skip all this because it requires another conference. But one of the very important artists is Leonardo Bellini, that I wanted to actually talk about him a little bit here, because besides being one of the artists identified at the beginning of the Vatican volume, is also the artist of the Rothschild, identified at the Rothschild miscellany, also in the Israel Museum collection. And there is a lot of touching points. Also, for example, I wanted to bring here the example of the astronomy. There are a few illustrations of astronomical scenes in the Rothschild miscellany in very different contexts, and that really show that this, on one hand, the stylistic, because we also have to relate to the fact, not only iconography, but also the stylistic, that show this common hand, where the patterns or where the origin of the illustration could come. But this is an ongoing process I'm just working on. And so now we want to do in 1 minute all the story of the manuscript that I tried to do. Okay. So its preservation, I thought its very vicissitudes that unfortunately cause also damages and losses throughout the following centuries, are also a testimony of the high appreciation of these codex. And actually reconnect to the very nice talk before. Some censor errors in both volumes indicate that this partially preserved all the 2 volumes were undergone this process of censors, but we don't have any signature. Maybe the signature were in the last folios or in the first volume, or in the missing pages. Anyway, we don't have censor signature for some reason. We have lacune of the sort of the both volume of the Mishneh Torah until the mid-19th century. The first volume, here, yes, the Vatican volume, was purchased by the humanist Giovanni Francesco de Rossi. He was from Rome, very, very turbulent story, and he was married Baroness Louise Charlotte of Borbone, also a very intriguing person, and eventually they got married, and he already lost his money, and she has the money. Reminds us was something that we already heard, but not so dramatic. I don't know about the dramas, but what happens is that in the end, most of the collection that then is known as the Rossiana collection, right, in the Vatican Library, he purchased he started purchasing in Rome from Collegio Carparalicense. And then he added a lot of other, he has thousands of volumes and manuscripts, not only manuscripts, but also. And for example, at the end of his life, he was in Venice. In fact, he died in Venice. I say that because if we think that, like, we allocate the Mishneh Torah in the Veneto region, that's what I think so. So maybe it could be that he purchased the manuscript in that region. but I don't have yet any proof about it. I really tried to look, but I didn't find. Anyway, in the end, the Zorziana collection was passed to Rome, to the Jesuits, first in Rome and then in Vienna and Linz, and then eventually was incorporated to the Vatican Library already from at least 921, 22, depends who you read, but that's solid. The second volume had much more turbulent sorts. So first of all, reached Germany at a certain point because it was part of the collection of Abraham Metzbacher of Munich. It is recorded to have been seen by Heinrich Frauberger in 1909. We don't have the list of the Metzbacher as far as I looked. And unless I missed something that I will be pleased to be addressed to. And then it was donated, apparently, via the help of the Rothschild, probably Edmund Rothschild, actually to the National University Library of Frankfurt. What was before the University of Frankfurt, this library, and at least in 1920, because it was on view there in 1920 exhibition. After surviving, but it doesn't appear in the Rothschild's collection. We now have a book. It doesn't appear. Our Mission Torah doesn't appear in the list, but there is a few lacune in the list. So I'm wondering maybe it's one of that. It has to be still understood, but nobody has a proof that it was in the Rothschild. Is that only be suggested? After surviving the Second World War, along with hundreds of thousands of volumes, in 1950, a Frankfurt family who had fled to New York acquired it and other important commodities and printed books in exchange for property that the city wished to acquire for municipal development. So it was there in a private family. It was actually known but not displayed, but it was displayed at least one time in New York. And then in 2007, Judy and Michael Steiner, New York, purchased it and entrusted it to the Museum on long-term loan for display, thus ensuring its conservation and accessibility for future generations. The conservation treatment that we undergone the manuscript, the museum's lab, to stabilize the manuscript, involved also reopening the binding, helping correct the order of the leaves, and ensuring that the text illustrations remain in their original sequence. In the Vatican volume has also some displaced lists, but they didn't do this process. And the rebinding, by the way, is the rebinding, all the binding process has been documented and is part of the movie in the gallery of the permanent gallery of illuminated manuscripts in the museum. That in the moment that doesn't work, so I didn't bring you to show, but I hope there will be work soon. Moreover, this loan allowed to renew the cooperation with the Vatican Library for a focus exhibit of our 2 volumes, Mishneh Torah. The positive relation between Israel Museum and the Vatican Library was developed since 2004 and 5, when a focus exhibition from Rome to Jerusalem for Jewish masterpieces from the Vatican Libraries was carried on. 4 of the most important illuminated manuscripts in the collection of the Judaica, or from the Rossiano collection, were exhibited for the first time in Israel, in honor of the museum's 14th anniversary. The renewed collaboration between the Israel Museum and the Vatican Library to display the 2 volumes had unfortunately been interrupted by the sale of our codex in New York. After a few months of suspense, we were literally sad that we maybe will lose again this treasure and will be again go in private hands. The codex was eventually jointly acquired by the Israel Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of New York, and the rotation display agreement was settled. The Metropolitan Museum agreed to start the rotation in a way to let the Israel Museum realize the vision to reunite the 2 codexes side by side again, so that it traveled back to Jerusalem to be displayed in Together Again exhibition in 2015 for the museum's 15th anniversary year. Furthermore, after display, it went back to New York for the very major Jerusalem exhibition in 2016, And then the code is traveled back to Jerusalem to be displayed again with the Vatican volume, this time not to tell the story of their reunion, but to accomplish the mission of the exhibition Maimonides, a legacy in script. This project aimed to present Maimonides' legacy throughout a comprehensive presentation of his original writings and rare illuminated manuscripts from France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Yemen. So in conclusion, this 2 volumes manuscript has raised its status from a Jewish privately commissioned and known manuscript for several generations to an intercultural encounter today. Luckily, most of it has been saved through our different collectors who estimated it for its textual, artistic, cultural, and historical implication. Its journey from a Jewish commission to its current status in leading cultural institutions, the Vatican Libraries holding the World Center of the Christian Church, Jerusalem in the Major Art Museum of the State of Israel, the Israel Museum, and New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the leading American Encyclopedic Museum. It's a sort of transatlantic ownership that bridges religious, cultural, and geographical divides. The manuscript presence in these esteemed institutions ensure that Maimonides' legacy continues to resonate in the modern and contemporary world, highlighting the enduring relevance of Jewish intellectual and also humanistic and artistic heritage. Its significance is a remarkable merging of esteemed content, artistic value, and historical relevance. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I hope you all are as curious as I am. I would like to invite my speakers to join me up here. So I'm Tess Arnes from Case Western Reserve University, and I am thrilled to moderate a brief Q&A. All right, let's get this party started. Who has a question? Yes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for such wonderful presentations. I have a question about the holdings that you said were lost during the war at the Rabbinical Library. Yeah, I think you mentioned 40,000 volumes were retrieved. What was the dimension of that collection? Do you know?
Oh, sorry, that was 20,000 volumes were lost and have not been recovered.
Okay.
It also had a very big and important collection.
And how vast was it? Do we know?
I have it somewhere in my notes, but I don't know. In terms of just like the number of volumes?
Well, just, sorry, I just wanted to get the context because I was interested in the decision-making process of the request from Rosa Gumpert. So, in other words, she was choosing between kind of, in effect, special interest, the Rabbinical collection that her husband had a connection, and then the one that was more of the patriotic state collection. So I was just curious to get a handle on how you contrast those two collections, or size and importance.
Exactly. I think that actually this was a question about whether one wanted to see oneself as Hungarian and also Jewish, and therefore think about the collection in that context, or should one put it into a distinctly Jewish institution. The Kaufman collection was the only, that was the beginning of the Jewish and then the Oriental collection at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. It didn't join a pre-existing collection of Hebrew manuscripts. The Rabbinical Seminary had quite an extensive collection of Hebrew manuscripts, and it was Kaufman in 1877, he went to Italy, to Padua and Mantua, and he purchased the Lelio della Torre collection for the Rabbinical Seminary. And so actually he was the one behind most of the Rabbinical Seminary's collection in and of themselves. But she made clear that it was the intentions of the deceased, whether that's Irma and David or somewhat questionable, to donate to the Hungarian Academy.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question for each one of you. Thank you very much. It was wonderful. I apologize, I came a little bit late, so maybe you spoke about it earlier, but you spoke a lot about the illuminated manuscripts, and you just mentioned the Geniza collection. I understand that the two ladies were not interested in these scraps of paper, but in your extensive work on the original Kaufmann collection, have you worked as well on the Geniza? And how he acquired, what were the sources from which he was acquiring the Geniza fragments, because we don't know so well what was the Kaufmann's channel. And for Anna, I would like to ask you about Merzbach. We were just wondering about his catalog, and I just wonder whether the acquisition of this particular manuscript had something to do with the project of Rafael Nata Rabinovich, who was buying books for Merzbach. Thank you.
Okay. So I start? Okay. You here? Okay. Thank you very much. You're right. I think when I was looking at this, I didn't find any evidence, but I didn't want to extend too much in this conference today, all these passages, and especially make supposition, as I said also about the Rothschild. So it is possible, and I hope that is gonna be good fruits. Also, by the way, I want to also go in Kaufmann, all this 18th century, also 17th, like late 19th century is very important to see all the listed, and it's something that requires, to be done. Sure, for sure. Thank you, because it's very engaging.
And in terms of the Geniza, it does appear that Irma was not super interested in the Geniza collection. He did acquire several crates from, it just says from an Egyptian Geniza, but that predates the collection that goes to Oxford. And Rebecca Jefferson thinks it's Kaufmann that actually may have been the source that Schechter winds up getting the collection. Through Elkan Adler. She has, it's her book, Cairo in the Age of Discovery.
It's rather Neubauer, I think, in her book.
Well, Neubauer, but Kaufmann had, so one of the things, she talks about how Kaufmann was always in touch with Adler, and that then maybe because he was showing Adler what he had, then Adler was back in Oxford, that he may have been connected. As to where he got his sources, there's a lot of question, whether it's Edelman, who was in Jerusalem, or maybe Wertheimer, who was connected to one of the other projects that he does, but nobody knows. And there's just this like cryptic mention by Shiver, who says that he saw a box labeled with the date 1894, Aus Geniza, something like that.
1984, so it would be
1894. Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be, yes, so it would be after Neubauer, and that would correspond indeed with the time when Neubauer was selling what he didn't want for Oxford to Elkan Nathan Adler.
I might have the date. I mean, I can look back because according to Jefferson, he had the Geniza fragments before, but
I checked them.
Yes,
but not before Neubauer.
I think the rest of the audience.
Okay, yes, sorry. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's, thank you, it's great. No, I just, because you went so deeply into the archives, so it's wonderful to have a confirmation. Thank you.
I don't think, no.
Oh, I believe the question was for everyone, so I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I don't think there was anything that I
another
could speak
question?
to.
Ideally for William?
Yeah. Thank you to all the panelists. it was fantastic, all the presentations. I have a question for William. As a lover of book bindings, I could totally relate to the Nazi librarian. How could he give up this beautiful book binding? But on the other hand, it strikes me as nowhere near medieval like the manuscript itself being medieval. It strikes me that the book binding itself was, I don't know, modern, 17th, 18th century maybe. And I was curious if the librarian had any kind of any more justification for why he didn't want to give up this book binding, well, its importance in his eyes.
So two things to say in context. The binding is 15th century by everybody who works on it, and perhaps contemporary with the manuscript, more likely a little later. There's a connoisseur. I don't think there's any doubt that it's 15th century, or I don't. The literature debates about the connoisseurship of the binding, about whether it may have been made by a Jewish bookbinder who has the same name as the author of the colophon. That's debated, but there's no doubt it's 15th century. The other thing to say is that your opinion about the binding, not about the date, but about the quality, is indeed supported. So in the 1927 facsimile of the thing, there's a lot of attention paid to the binding. The binding is said to be of great importance. So this view that, oh, if you're displaying the binding, you're desecrating the manuscript is I think partly an invented argument to recover the things. The claim that the text and the pictures are more important than the binding is clearly a matter of dispute about what you think is more important, and is not supported in the Jewish literature. So your question was why he was so interested in the binding? The museum lacked a cut leather binding, which it had a quite extensive collection. Cut leather binding was a class of binding from 15th century Germany that was missing in the museum and was prized, at least by Eberhard, and so he wanted that. And there was negotiation with Darmstadt, actually, about which of the cut leather bindings he was going to take from the library. And he took the Haggadah, he claims, because they wanted to keep other things, but he did want a 15th century German cut leather binding.
I would have thought that they might have been able to work out a compromise, leave him the binding, and to take the manuscript and put a new binding on it.
Well, they actually did. In 1942, they borrowed multiple objects from Darmstadt, and they got the Haggadah back in 1953, 54, 52. They didn't get the other two books back until the 70s, 80s. So there was a bit of a compromise. I mean, Darmstadt wanted them all back, but the Hesse cabinet, did a Solomonic, or non-Solomonic, but a false Solomonic. But they said you can have the Haggadah, but later the Offenbach gets to keep the other two bindings.
All right. Well, please feel free to ask our speakers any additional questions over tea or coffee. Is that right? Yeah. Over tea or coffee. I know I have some burning questions, and let's please join me in offering a round of applause. We're just going to take a brief break so we can try to stay on time. So just 10 minutes, if you could try to manage. There's coffee and cookies in the research forum.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our final panel of the day. Before getting started, I would just like to extend my thanks again to our organizers and speakers for putting on such a fabulous conference. My name is Sam Truman. I am a PhD candidate at Case Western Reserve University. I am also currently serving as the Samuel H. Kress Institutional Fellow here at the Courtauld. The speakers on this panel will discuss both the importance and sustained difficulty of incorporating Jewish material culture into museum displays, particularly in museums that are canonical or encyclopedic. Speakers will each discuss a recent or current project enabling attendees to better understand the present issues and priorities facing curators, including acquisitions, displays, and provenance. The roundtable that follows will be an opportunity for museum professionals to respond to each other and to answer questions from attendees, facilitating an open conversation on the symposium's themes. Introducing the speakers and guiding the roundtable will be Elizabeth Morrison, the Senior Curator of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum. During her almost 30 years there, Beth has curated numerous exhibitions, including Imagining the Past in France, 1250 to 1500, held in 2010, and Book of Beasts, the Bestiary in the Medieval World, in 2019, both of which were finalists for the College Arts Association Award for Outstanding Exhibition Catalog.
Beth has served on the board of the International Center of Medieval Art and is vice president of the Association of Art Museum Curators. She was also recently elected a fellow of the Medieval Academy of America. With that, I will hand the floor over to Beth.
I, as everyone else, would like to start by thanking the organizers of this wonderful conference, especially because Reed is currently at the Getty, and Laura is currently working on her final project dissertation, which largely concerns the Rothschild Pentateuch. So I feel like I have a real personal link to both these wonderful women. And I'm very excited that this last session for this conference concerns museums and the collections of Judaica, Hebrew manuscripts, and their display collecting, because I think for the themes of this exhibition, which is tracing Jewish histories, I feel that as curators is our raison d'etre, is to share these histories of pre-modern Jewish peoples, and it's an important part of the legacy of these objects, making their stories known in new and creative ways. So I'm really excited for this forthcoming panel. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all speakers at once, and then they will deliver their remarks, and it will be followed by very short remarks by me about our one Hebrew manuscript at the Getty, and then we will all have a chance for an interesting discussion. So first I'm going to introduce Simona Di Neppi, who is the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Curator of Judaica at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where she was responsible for building and displaying the Judaica collection and for curating intentional beauty Jewish ritual art from the collection, the museum's first Judaica gallery. She has filled curatorial roles at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the National Gallery, and the Royal Academy of Arts in London. In Israel, she worked as curator at ANU, the Museum of the Jewish People. Simona has published widely, including essays for The Lives of Jewish Things, Collecting and Curating Material Culture, and Jewish Italy, Rediscovered Stories. Simona is currently co-curating with Boston University students Real and Imagined, Rembrandt and the Jews of the 17th Century Dutch Republic, an in-focus dossier exhibition scheduled for December 2025 to December 2026, to which we're all looking forward. Next, I will introduce Riva Arnold, who joined the European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 2023 as the Research Associate for Judaica. Riva's areas of expertise include Judaica, ritual textiles, synagogue interiors, and historic ornament. Before joining the department, she was an adjunct faculty member at Yeshiva University. She is currently on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts. Prior to completing her PhD at the University of Zurich, she received her MA in the History of Design and Material Culture from the Royal College of Art. And our third speaker will be Alice Mittner, who is an expert in decorative arts, and she joined the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2018 as curator of the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert collection. In 2019, she co-curated a groundbreaking display, Concealed Histories, uncovering the story of Nazi looting art, which ran from December 2019 to January 2021, and was curated with Dr. Jacques Schumacher, the Gilbert Provenance curator. Alice has been working on addressing the museum's Jewish heritage in all its forms and aspects, and co-organized a public symposium in November 2024 entitled The V&A and Its Jewish Heritage, Objects and Stories. And now I'll ask Simona to come up and share her remarks.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here today, again at the Courtauld, where I studied with Joanna Cannon 25 years ago, and to be here to share the story of Judaica and Jewish art at the MFA Boston. So first, I really want to thank Laura and Reed for their warm invitation, and especially for their encouragement when I panicked, but I don't have anything medieval, to think more expansively about this specific talk and to share my experiences collecting and incorporating Jewish objects as a whole in an encyclopedic museum like the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So in this brief talk, I will ask 4 questions. How did it even come about, Judaica at the MFA? When did it start, when we started to collect Judaica? What do we own and collect? How do we display Judaica? And most importantly today, what are the obstacles for the acquisition of medieval Jewish material? First, however, it's important that I say a few words at the MFA, about the MFA Boston. It's the 4th or 5th largest art museum in the US with a collection of over 500,000 objects. And what is important to keep in mind is that its strongest holdings to this day, which are Egyptian, Nubian, ancient Greek, Roman, Japanese to a certain extent, where these collections were formed in the first decades of the museum's life, thanks to an early interest on the part of the curators, the trustees, and the donors. Ta-ta! This is a very different trajectory that Judaica followed. Silence, absence of purposeful, deliberate, intentional collecting, as opposed to accidental collecting that I call. In fact, the first intentional Judaica acquisition only happened in 2009, and the museum was founded in 1870 with the purchase at Sotheby's of the splendid silver-gilded German mid-18th century Hanukkah lamp, which we still have on view. And the museum at that point thought, mission accomplished, we have one great example of Judaica. They couldn't predict that 4 years later, Tulsa philanthropist Lynn Schusterman would donate 120 objects from her collection, which are only domestic Judaica, no synagogue Jewish ritual art, to the museum. And it's a very eclectic collection. As you can see from this collage, it includes paintings, textiles, ceramics, a lot of metalwork, majority of it, works on paper, and sculptures. So what the museum did, my predecessor, Marietta Cambareri, at the time, is that a small number of highlights from the Schusterman collection were installed in the Gallery for European 18th Century Decorative Arts, and interspersed with non-Jewish objects from the same region and from the same period. And I'm showing you here an example on the left with a Sukkot plate from Delft with other Delft well all around. So this approach, which we tend to call integration model, to show Judaica integrated throughout the museum, would remain the mode of display at the MFA, the only mode of display at the MFA for the following 10 years, both for practical reasons, because at that point we didn't have a collection that was large enough to grant a gallery, but also to create dialogue with, as opposed to separation from the surrounding cultures. When 4 years later I arrived in Boston from Tel Aviv to take up the first dedicated Judaica curatorship in the US in an encyclopedic museum, and this speaks a lot to the commitment of the MFA, the first task I set for myself was to establish what Judaica should be in our collecting policy at the MFA. So to do that, I also defined it for our audience, and I created a webpage where, as you can see at the very beginning, we describe Judaica in the canonical, more narrow way of Jewish ritual items to be used at home or in the synagogue. However, if you go to the last few lines, you see that we said, well, actually, I think it can be anything that is in some way an expression of Jewish experience, history, and culture. So it can be painting, or sculpture, postcard, or ancient coin. So I broadened it up significantly. And this variety, or greed perhaps, ultimately guided our acquisition strategy, which I have pursued in two ways. Firstly, the obvious way is by seeking new purchases and gifts. And to this day, in the past 7.5 years, we made about 60 new acquisitions, major acquisitions, but also unexpected things, and this gives you a sense of the variety. From the top right, an Iranian ketubah, marriage contract, just below it, an Italian bronze Ferrari 16th century medal, and then Arthur Schick, a Book of Esther, feminist, Judaica, and so on. But then there was a second way that I thought we should acquire Judaica, what I call internal acquisitions, meaning to scour in the existing MFA collection, in the disparate MFA departments, textiles, Asia, contemporary, prints and drawings, for works that enter the museum without being understood, interpreted, displayed, discussed as Jewish. So these are so-called internal acquisitions or unnoticed intruders. And the age of unnoticed intruders really covers the majority of the life of our institution. And one such recent example of unearthed object is this long linen textile, which we now catalog as Torah binder, late 16th century, and it's in our, maybe from Veneto, and it's in our Judaica gallery. And I want to say, this is important, that when I talk about unnoticed intruders, this is by no means a unique story of the MFA. The Met, the V&A, and practically all encyclopedic museums have hidden in storage, or not hidden, objects that were collected as textiles, prints, silver work, but they're in fact Jewish or Judaica. So how do we show this growing and diverse collection? For the first few years, I continued only with the integrated model that I just explained to you, showing Judaica alongside non-Jewish objects. And we've expanded in 7 years from 2 galleries for Judaica to 15 now, just to give you a sense of where we are located in the museum. Clockwise from the top, Art of the Islamic Cultures, a period room in Scotland, 17th century, Netherlands, 17th century, contemporary studio craft, bottom right, colonial Newport, Rhode Island, America mid-20th century, decorative arts, Europe, you've seen it, Italian Renaissance, and European paintings gallery. Now, one of the challenges that I'm sure my colleagues share of the integrated model is visibility. So to help visitors to find, to track down Judaica, we recently produced 2 tools that are both printed and with a QR code. The one on the left is a list, not a comprehensive list of all the Judaica on view, but I chose one object for each gallery. So each object you see is the number of galleries where we have Judaica, and on the right we have an audio guide, which we called Jewish Stories, and again you can see it's very diverse. You can see an ancient Jewish coin, a shofar, contemporary feminist Judaica, and so on. And we've done this with Bloomberg Connected, many museums use. But it doesn't stop here, because in December 2023, we opened our inaugural Judaica dedicated gallery, the first in Boston, and that I know of, one of only 5 such spaces in the world, and I mean in encyclopedic museum. We now, therefore, both integrate Judaica throughout and have a dedicated gallery, because we feel that Jewish identity can be both things at once. It is part of the wider culture, but also retains a core individual heritage.
that is worthy of being explored and discussed and looked at, by itself. So, what does Intentional Beauty, this is the name of our Judaica gallery, contain? It features new acquisitions on display for the very first time, very diverse in terms of media, geography, and chronology. You can see here, again, this collage. We have furniture, silver, textiles, what's on paper, paintings, and I'm sure I'm forgetting something, stretching from India, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Israel, many countries in Europe, North Africa, and America. And in terms of chronology, it's late 16th century to the 21st century. So, what is missing? Oh, what time did I start? I didn't look at the watch. We're done. What is missing from these successes? Of course, a medieval Jewish presence. Despite the fact that when I started and I was asked to do a Judaica collection strategy, the top priority that I've been putting in the Judaica collection strategy every year and updating is a medieval or Renaissance illuminated manuscript. And so I have now removed all the prices and all the private names and everything. Usually the prices are there. And the reason that the prices are there is because as I travel throughout the years to examine these treasures, the first significant obstacle that I found, challenge, is the price tag of many millions that they carry. So it's not only the absence of a large acquisition endowment, and I'm only speaking for the MFA. Different encyclopedic museums are in different financial situations, but also the lack of fundraising opportunities with donors who are interested in this kind of material. Not only that, we have all recently witnessed how even when the medieval item in question is not an illuminated manuscript, but a metal bowl, if I may say, with more uncertain origin and date, it still carries an estimate of 3 to 5 million. So challenge number one, an obvious one, the price, the high price. Challenge number two, the provenance. In the hypothetical event that we had 7 millions to buy an illuminated manuscript, 7 millions or more, another major obstacle is provenance, especially the objects whereabout between 1933 and 1945. The MFA is especially rigorous on provenance, and I think the museum has been a pioneering institution, and that's because we've been the first museum to appoint a provenance curator 22 years ago. Tori Reed has been with the museum as provenance curator, now chair, for 22 years. And you've noticed that now other museums have got the memo. And they're also hiring provenance specialists. So I've been discussing these challenges, and they all become the more pressing now that we're about to start a major 5-year project, the planning of the new European medieval galleries, led by my colleague, senior curator Marietta Cambarelli. We're very excited that for the first time in 20 years, the medieval collection will be exhibited in this spectacular gallery that closed in 2005, that houses the portal from the church of San Miguel in the town of Un Castillo in Aragon, Spain. So we have 5 years to figure this out and to figure out how to include Jewish stories. How can we do it? I skipped this. I was going to say that it's much easier in a history museum where I used to work because you can use facsimile of great manuscripts and a model of Santa Maria la Blanca. But we cannot do that. Do we have any object in the collection that is medieval or medieval looking at all? We have this small lamp that Alice will recognize, and many of you will recognize because it's found in numerous collections. And I, on purpose, didn't give the date and the origin because it varies widely. You know, it's French
North Italian, Spanish, German, 13th, 14th, 15th century. Also prompted, thankfully, by Julie Harris, who has written to us and the V&A because she's doing a systematic investigation of all these lamps and of the metal composition of this lamp. We've done an XRF, ray fluorescence. I have just another slide. And what's interesting and surprising to me is actually that it showed that it's not bronze, as it said in all the books and in the literature. But the metal composition is closer to medieval metalsmithing practice, which, in addition to copper and tin, which is bronze, also has all these other metals. Doesn't mean that it's medieval, but it's an interesting thing to be aware of in this research that Julie Harris is doing. The second thing we can do, the Met has been doing this so successfully over the years with the Jewish Theological Seminary, is to borrow manuscript. Third thing, use of interpretation, use of text panels to draw attention of visitors to what is missing. This is a text panel we wrote for one of our Renaissance gallery talking about the Jewish Italian community in the Renaissance. That is an object that we actually have. So we have different ways that we can cope with that. And last slide, we're lucky because the portal from the San Miguel Church in Castillo is from the town where there is a Barrio Judío, a Jewish neighborhood with a synagogue that has been studied, and this whole neighborhood has been promoted. So we may link that in our interpretation. So I close this by saying that we have 5 years to figure the medieval galleries out, and this is an opportunity for outreach. Please come to us with suggestions, ideas, comments. Thank you so much.
Hello, can you all hear me? Hi. So this afternoon, what I'd like to do is really share what the European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Department has been doing over the past few years. I speak on behalf of the department. It's been an active conversation in our department. We call it the Judaica Initiative. It started in 2013 with Luke Sison. It is now continued with Sarah Lawrence. So it is a really wonderful project that ESDA has started along with our colleagues in Medieval, which some of you know. And the intention was to really elevate a gap within our collecting practice, but to also think about our display, our conversations, our programming as they relate to the European, primarily the European Jewish experience. So this Judaica initiative is still going strong. We intentionally think about different to the MFA in many ways and other institutions. We have a curatorial intention to display our objects across the main galleries. So here are your 4 main galleries, 304, 503, which is now called the Dick Wolf Gallery, Gallery 551, and Gallery 556. So those are the 4 main spaces that display our Judaica cases. And to sort of assist with this conversation and this programming, we received 2 very generous grants from the Lilly Endowment and the David Berg Foundation to really further establish our commitment to research, acquisitions, and educational programming. So with that in mind, it's been a really active year in addition to these 2 grants. And we've also created our first iteration of a Jewish virtual art tour, which takes visitors through these spaces. We discussed recent acquisitions with them. We have a special installation of a Hebrew manuscript, which you just heard about from Anna on the Mishnah Torah, which I'll show you in a moment. And I created a symposium, which I'll share with you at the end. So it's been a really active year considering the challenges we also have of provenance, and also acquiring and also getting the message out that we do have Judaica. So we don't actually have a guidebook or a map. And one of the first questions I receive a lot is, oh, I didn't know the Met had Judaica. I didn't know you were collecting. I don't know where to find it. But we do have it, and we do believe in this curatorial intention to display our objects around the museum spaces, to bring in those wider conversations. So if you've all been to the Met, you know it covers 1,000 years of the creative human experience. So we are really dedicated to trying to find a way to enhance that with the Jewish lived experience. What are those relationships with artisans? What are those relationships with collectors and communities? And how does that affect how our visitors enhance and incorporate and think about the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a whole? So that's really what ESDA is really sort of thinking about, or what I'm thinking about on a very regular basis. So when you come to the museum, you do partake in a Jewish ritual art tour. The first stop on your tour, or second stop on the tour, depending on who's organizing it, you would stop in Gallery 503, which is our Italian decorative arts gallery from 1500 roughly to 1900 loosely. And what was known before with this wonderful gallery, you had the imposing Farnese table with a young sculpture by Michelangelo. But in 2013, we incorporated a manuscript case alongside the Rothschild Machzor, which is a loan from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And it started to really activate the space in a very different way. And then most recently, as part of a research collaboration with the European Paintings Department, is this painting by Antonio Campi, a portrait of a man with a Hebrew tablet. So together, what this space has now become is not only a space of Italian beautiful works of art, but it's also created a space where visitors who are seeking a Jewish history or an additional history to this idea of the European sculpture period is to now think about the Jewish experience within that conversation. What is the power of Hebrew? How is it being circulated? How are visitors and patrons and communities thinking about Hebrew language, and where is it going, right? So you have two Hebrew manuscripts and then a painting by what we now understand is actually of a not Jewish sitter. For a while we thought it was a Jewish, or I guess we hoped it would be a Jewish man with a portrait of Hebrew, but for lack of time and a later conversation with my colleagues in Florence and other places in Italy, we now can understand that it's actually not a portrait of a Jewish individual, which we can talk about at another coffee break. So those are the four main galleries, and then when you continue on to Gallery 551, sort of nearby, we have every December a special holiday installation. So I'll talk a bit more about the significance of this installation and the collection, but every December we install this fabulous Galician Hanukkah lamp from the 19th century. It's from the Moldovan family collection in New York, and it's a really wonderful installation. It connects, we place it in front of the Temple of Solomon model, which we all know was in the 1887 exhibition here in London. And additionally, in the end of 2025, we're actually going to have a third sort of temporary case that speaks to what, within the department, we have a sort of case study where different curators and fellows can incorporate different objects from the collection sort of as a rotating case. So then we'll have another case of Judaica sort of nearby. So you'll have Gallery 551, you'll have this Hanukkah display, and then you'll also have this rotating case, which will be a combination of recent acquisitions and objects never on view before. So it'll be a really activated space, which we're really excited about, and our visitors look forward to this wonderful loan of this Hanukkah lamp from the Moldovan family. So when you come to the museum, or if you've been to the museum and you were looking for a Judaica, our first acquisitions were really in 1913 and 1917. Okay, so these two objects, like Simona referenced, we can call them sleepers or objects that we didn't know were Judaica. Obviously, we have a Hanukkah lamp, which we all know is clearly Judaica, and then we have a dedication cup for a very prominent court Jew, Bernhard Lehmann. So both of these objects came from larger collections, which were donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. 1913 and 1917, there's actually a similar sconce-shaped lamp in the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam. So those are the first two really gifts, you could say, part of these larger gifts in the collection. And then there's about a 100-year gap between any sort of collecting practice. So 2013, 2016, you then have the initiation of the Judaica initiative with Luke Sison, really starting to require Met quality pieces, sound provenance, and things that we know can be worthy of display within our galleries, and objects that are obviously rich not only from our standard of aesthetics and sort of as it relates to our wider galleries, but also objects that really connect to this sort of contact zone with the past of Jewish Italian communities at the same time. So if you were looking for, again, Italian silver, now you have this addition of a beautiful Torah crown and finials. So, sort of echoing what Simona said, the challenge of provenance has sort of taken over how we think about acquisitions, how far we can go in an acquisition process. And while it is sort of challenging for all the many ways of not knowing, especially Judaica has a very, very difficult sort of space to know where an item of domestic Judaica was between 1933 and 1945. It's a challenge for every institution represented here. We have still required and acquired acquisitions over the past year. So I started really in 2023, but it's been a really active year, so I just wanted to sort of show you what we've been doing, because many of the objects are not on view. Sometimes they're still downstairs in acquisition, conservation. We also require space, so that's also a part of a process. So the first object I worked on was from the Rothschild sale at Christie's. We acquired this pair of Torah finials. We acquired a box of circumcision instruments, which I'm actually very excited to show a room of scholars, because this always gets a lot of conversation. Is it Jewish? Is it not? The landing so far that it is, but I'm sure there's many opinions here. But it's a really interesting leather box with a scene of circumcision of Hagar and Sarah, and the mystery scene, which I welcome all opinions and interpretations are, of the men sort of entering the scene and pointing. So it's always a conversation, and I open it up to the floor at some point if you have any ideas. And that's the interior of it. So it was actually part of a different history. It came from a collector that you would never assume would have an object like this. But you can see from conservation's perspective all the many ways it's been sort of ripped out, reused. But that's the basis of what's in the box, sort of this division of what we can assume held the circumcision instruments. Okay, so I'll leave that up for conversation, but that's a really interesting acquisition. A coconut cup, which we acquired as well, which will be a forthcoming article, hopefully at the end of 2026, I hope. But it's a really beautiful object that speaks to not only clearly a dedication, a ceremonial cup, but it has 3 different scenes that we can actually sort of map to different printed books and imagery that was sort of circulated by, obviously, the 19th century. Our first Passover plate, which we are very excited about, especially because it has the mark of Israel Latz, who's the one of the very well-known Turin Jewish silversmiths at the 19th century. So we have his mark, which has actually just literally been reinstalled for the Passover holiday as part of our annual pop-up tours we offer for the high holidays and Passover. So it was really popular with our visitors to see something that was maybe not a traditional Passover plate or Seder plate, especially if you come from New York. We have different styles, and they've never seen a plate like this before. Not on view, because it's a very recent acquisition, is this wonderful fish-formed spice container. The head lifts, and you see the Hebrew alphabet. But it has a really wonderful weight, and the body moves, so it's a really wonderful besamim. And then we have this, one of the only few known domestic items of Judaica by Augustus Ferdinand Gensmer. We know he has Torah finials and Torah shields, but this is one of his few known, and there's a very similar one in Boston MFA. One of the few known domestic items of Judaica within our collection, and it's lovely. It's very small. It's not larger than maybe 6 or 7 inches. It's really, really wonderful. And then this was a really significant acquisition. It was a project I worked on in conjunction with European paintings to, again, speak to where this Judaica initiative is falling in line, right? So it's really just Esda. It really lives in medieval primarily, but on occasion we have these collaborative projects, like with the European Paintings Department, where they acquire an object that speaks to the richness of a different idea, a different type of history, a different type of significance of the Hebrew language, which again we can talk about because this painting always gets a lot of attention, especially with the Hebrew. All of you can read it. So it's a really, really wonderful collection. So that's all to say that even with the limitations of provenance, we have still acquired a significant amount in the past year. In terms of what we're hoping to do for the future, and what we're trying to work on towards an unknown date, but a real serious initiative that we're working on, is alongside our colleagues in the Textile Conservation Department. We have a mantua Torah curtain that was gifted to us, and it requires a lot of conservation treatment. Here's Lizzie Cleland, who's a curator of textiles in ESDA, Julia Costrani, who's our conservator for textiles. So we're hoping to get this on view as well, and then a Torah binder as well. So these have never been on view before, but we're working with conservation to hopefully install them in our galleries as a future project. So to go back to sort of the symposium that I briefly touched on, so I don't know why the font got so strange there, but so at the end of last year, we were celebrating, that's Simona actually photographed. At the end of last year, it was the 10th, almost 11th anniversary of this Hanukkah lamp from the Malvin family collection in New York. And to sort of celebrate that and to do something a little bit different, I keep saying we because it was a really team effort, but I organized the first Judaica symposium for the European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Department. I know Medieval has done other events in relationship to the Jerusalem exhibition and their manuscripts with Melanie Holcomb. But this was a first for ESDA. This was a really significant move to incorporate and include a localized selection of scholars, Simona, Temple Emmanuel in New York, Abigail from the Jewish Museum, Julie Dweck from Princeton. Okay, so it was a wonderful space and time to highlight Judaica, highlight the Jewish experience, to highlight collections and new acquisitions across different institutions. But what it really did was sort of my intention was to place the Met in the wider conversation of Judaica and collection practice. In addition to that, it was intended to really, if you think of the Met as a space of research and scholarship, I really feel strongly that while we have to sort of acquire objects slower than other institutions, I wanted to really place the museum as a center for research. I want scholars similar to this room to feel that we can create symposiums and moments of scholarship to come together and work in tandem with other collections and curators within the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So while we don't have a Judaica gallery, we have a curatorial intention, we acquire relatively slowly to other institutions, I really feel strongly that and because it was such a successful event, we will do another symposium at the end, really the beginning of 2026. So you will see that circulated because it really sort of kick-started this idea that we can create a center for research, a center for Jewish scholarship and thinking and conversation within the European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Department, and hopefully within the wider museum as well. So thank you for listening. And
Okay, well, thank you, Laura and Reid, for inviting me speaking. I think the last speaker of the day, apart from Elena, with your closing remarks, and it's going to be very different from the level of detail that you've seen so far for the last day and a half. Because I'm actually not a Judaica specialist, I am not a Judaica curator, and yet I'm here to talk about the V&A and a British national institution, museum, an encyclopedic museum, and how the Judaica has been formed part of our collection. Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. So, as I said, there's never been actually a Judaica curator or specialist at the V&A, but yet the V&A in the 19th century is one of the first European non-specialist public institutions to actively collect Judaica. And it's one of the 3 British public institutions to present some Judaica pieces during the Anglo-Jewish exhibition at the Royal Albert Hall in 1887. And it's also very interesting because the institution exhibited, lent 25 pieces, mainly metal work and textile. And the other 2 public institutions were the London Metropolitan Archive and the British Museum. So they were presenting manuscript archive, but the public institution that the V&A was the only one to present actual objects. But there are still a lot of questions about the why and the how the V&A decided to participate to the Anglo-Jewish exhibition and therefore its acquisition policy towards Judaica. So there's some explanation possible. There is, we are in the 1850s. The V&A was first created in 1852 and then moved to South Kensington in 1857. So you are at the moment where there is a considerable influence from the Anglo-Jewish community. There's an increasing, forming, I would say, Anglo-Jewish elite, accessing the upper social and political echelon, building also art collections, and I'm not only thinking about the Rothschild, but for example, Isidor Spielmann, who founded the Art Fund as well. And also dealers. Muremark was a Dutch dealer who was very well established in London of Jewish heritage, and he really is the one that triggered the fever, the passion for blue and white porcelain in England. And he also sold those wonderful pair of rimonim and the mantle to the V&A in 1870. But the other not exclusively, but there is also at the same time a profound interest from Christian collectors for archaeological and Judeo-Christian artifacts. And one of them is Gaspar Purdon Clark, his name is here. He was a military man, and by the 1876 he was working freelance for the V&A, buying objects during his frequent travels, including Indian collection as well as Judaica. And he became director of the V&A in 1896. However, Christopher Wilk, who is one of our head of department, keeper, as we call them at the V&A, his explanation during our conference in November last year was when the V&A lent to the Anglo-Jewish exhibition, the objects collected were not acquired because they represented the Jewish religion or wider Jewish culture. The early V&A collected and displayed Jewish objects as it did most others, as example of excellence in ornamentation, techniques of making, and for the quality of their design. Stories about how these Jewish objects were used were not central to their presence in the museum. So here it is, that's the statement for this morning. I would love to dig further into the archive. I would love to really lead onto a proper research project about this because I think there is so much to understand. But what it means today is that there's never been an active policy aiming to assemble a collection of Jewish objects, and let alone a comprehensive one. The museum main collection were designated and are always still designated by material or object type, so woodwork, textile, metalwork, ceramics. And other object type or material that were collected simply had to fit within those categories. So we are very much on an ad hoc initiative, unlike the MFA and the Met, even though I know it's coming quite late, but we are still with that in mind. So the group object that can be described as the Judaica collection of the V&A is formed from sporadic small donation and acquisition. There are two main moments though that I'd like to highlight here. It's the major acquisition in 1855, so the very, very beginning of the V&A history, where the museum pledged a allowance from the government to acquire part of the Ralph Bernal collection. And the Ralph Bernal collection included Sèvres, porcelain, but it also included furniture, as you can see on the very far, my left, your right in the mirror. But it also included a wedding ring and the earliest spice box for Havdalah, I think, ever known. Elina, you correct me if I'm wrong on that one. The other key moment is 100 years after, in 1956, there was a major donation by Walter Leo Hilper, who was an American collector who gave more than 3,000 objects to the museum. So the Ralph Bernal collection was about 500 objects, and in 1956 it's 3,000 objects to the museum, including Italian Renaissance, clock, metalwork, but also some Judaica. Interestingly, reference to the sleepers as well that Riva and Simona were mentioning, especially the Haftalah, the spice boxes for Haftalah, they were described as Christian. They were really sleepers, and they've only been discovered or reattributed for their, I would say, Jewish purposes, ritual, much later on. Meanwhile, though, in the 20th century, there's been a few public outreaches to discuss this collection. So in 1956, the V&A organized a Anglo-Jewish art and history exhibition in commemoration of the 10th centenary of the resettlement of the Jew in the British Isle. Very long title, but so 1656, Oliver Cromwell invited the Jewish community, Sephardim community of Amsterdam to settle in London, in England, and that's really what started. The Jewish community could settle back in England, and that was celebrated in 1956. There was also at the same time an exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery. In 1991, the V&A published its first catalogue of the Judaica collection, which I think could benefit from updated research, but it's still very, very. It doesn't have a comprehensive. It doesn't look into the history of collecting. The mere purpose is to really list what we have and how much information that they could get at the time. But at least we've got that, and it's published. Really, what triggered, and I think Simona, you'll be able to comment on as well, is the preparation of the Sacred Silver Galleries, which opened in 2005, and naturally, as we know, that's meant that already in 1999, people were, curators were started working on that. And that's really what triggered focus on the Judaica pieces owned by the museum. So there's been an update of the cataloguing, but there's also been some loan and commission of contemporary pieces, as you can see here. So the one here is a commission from the V&A to the artist Ruth Taylor Jacobson, and then the other one was a loan at the moment of the opening of the Sacred Silver Galleries, and it's been turned into a donation in 2012. And of course, that's what we have, 2 cases dedicated to the Judaica collection of the museum, which are in our Sacred Silver. It's interesting because initially the Sacred Silver, I think, were actually called the Christian Silver, and really you do have about 90% of the cases and grouping are dedicated to all forms of Christianity in Britain, non-conformist, Catholic, absolutely everything. You then have 2 cases about Judaica, 1 case about Eastern Europe Orthodox, and then 1 tiny case about Ethiopia, because we've got those looted objects from the Magdala battle in 1868. So the proportion is not quite, I think, quite right, but yet it's still something. And for a public museum that has no curator or even researcher, associate researcher dedicated to the Judaica and the Jewish history, it's still better than nothing. So I'm sure, during our panel, we're going to discuss why and how, where those haddock strategy are relevant and appropriate and enough. But what I thought I would mention here is because I am the curator of the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Galleries and Collection. And as we started in 2022 a redevelopment of the galleries, I thought that those were the vector for further engagement about Jewish histories. And as you might know, understand, at the V&A, it's always the object that leads the story, not the other way around. And I've done my first mistake by actually trying desperately to do the other way around, and that was terrible. So Arthur and Rosalind, why this is important, because they were both born in 1913 in England from Jewish families. Arthur's family especially was really Orthodox, and they had emigrated from Poland in the 1890s and settled as garment maker, furrier, tailors in Eastern London. And so they've always been engaged with their Jewish heritage in many different ways. So that's why I thought this is our moment where we really can talk about it, and through a few objects we can talk about their Jewish identity, and therefore about everything else that has been shaping the story of the DNA. These are the galleries in 2000 before we closed in March 2024. And we did have some audience consultation, and that was absolutely fascinating and a real learning curve, because you can see the different quotes here. But for many of them, mentioning, audience consultation, we invited people who identified as of Jewish heritage to discuss precisely that topic. And we understood that, mentioning the Gilbert Jewish identity could seem disingenuous. It would only be relevant if there were evidence that their heritage actively influenced their collection. Some participants felt that it was a way of outing the Gilbert as different. The recurrent question, would we do that for a Christian collector? And I'm thinking about this morning, discussion as well about, German versus Jewish. And I know it was a different political context, but in a way it's the same, why am I different? And so with that in mind, our interpretation could seem tokenistic. And also, it is true that the Gilbert moved to California and made an incredible fortune. And a lot of participants actually were feeling really concerned about feeding the trope of Jewish identity, money, and they say the Gilbert story is not typical of the Anglo-Jewish biography. So we had to shift my concept, my mistake, which was, I thought, we should have like a very central, prominent case grouping, addressing the Gilbert Jewish identity, and through the object we could have talked about the Museum Judaica, the Anglo-Jewish art collectors, and instead we had to carefully design some really focus points through the object from the Gilbert collection. So again, going back to what do we have in the collection, and what are the stories that those objects are telling us. So first of all, in 2019, we organized a display about uncovering the Nazi looting. And these are all the objects from the Gilbert collection, which not necessarily were a case of restitution, might have been a case of restitution, restituted and then sold later on, but yet the Jewish owner was persecuted during the Nazi era, and that is something that we wanted to highlight. In a way, I would say that was probably the easiest point to flag up, because I would say, the horror of the Holocaust and the Nazi looting is now something that is public knowledge. It's addressed. There is a legal structure around it as well to really help us. So that was the relatively easy grouping to put together, and so that display was embedded in our previous galleries for a year and a half, and now we've decided to turn it into a permanent feature that you will discover in our new galleries. The next point was actually about the fashion scrapbook, because as I said, they were part of that, Jewish immigrant community, Eastern London, garment maker as well. I don't know for whomever lives in Britain, if you had a chance to see the exhibition last year at the Museum of London, Fashion City, how Jewish Londoners shape the global style, but that was really interesting. And there's nothing about the Gilbert, but we are working very closely with the fashion historian. And so through that facsimile, you can see a little render here, we are going to print it out, we are going to point the importance of that story, of all that community that really shaped and contributed to the fashion business and beyond. But we are also going to address the underlying anti-Semitic comment that the Anglo-Jewish community experienced at the time. These are photos of catwalk, of Rosalind's design, and you can see there's all a bit of like sequin or embellishment or beading or sparkling. And that at the time, not only for her, but for a lot of those designers who were all from that Jewish community, were, highly criticizing the press, this is not Britain. they overstep the limit of good taste. This is exotic, this is seductive. So there's a lot here that we are going to talk through as well, and you know, I think really make visitors understand what it was at the time. And then finally, Judaica objects. I'm sorry to disappoint you after a day and a half of looking at all this wonderful Judaica manuscript and object. The Gilberts have only, but they did not want to collect Judaica, first of all. But Arthur, at the end of his life, acquired three objects, a pair of rimonim and a Torah crown. And that was, they were actually the really most complex to discuss and to present in our new galleries because, well, first of all, those have always been in store, precisely for that reason. And the other one, the Torah crown, has always been in the Sacred Silver Gallery, in the Judaica case. So precisely, it's always been very difficult and challenging to address the Jewish identity of the Gilbert with the rest of the collection. Also because, as I said, they didn't want to collect Judaica, their Jewish identity did not influence their collecting, in a way that those, should have a really prominent position. Yet, I really wanted to address that complexity. So, what we've done for the pair of rimonim, you might not see here on the photo, but actually they are engraved with their owner in the 19th century, who was Philip Salomon, the brother of David Salomon, the first Jewish mayor of London in 1855. So we are now putting those rimonim in a grouping where we're talking about collectors, and the collectors collected by the Gilberts. And through that, we are able then to mention Philip Salomon, the importance of the Anglo-Jewish community in the 1850s, 1900 in Britain, and the beginning of collecting Judaica in Britain. And then the second one is the Torah crown. As I said, it used to be, it's still actually, for whoever is coming with me this afternoon, it is in the Sacred Silver Galleries. So initially, we thought, well, let's put it in the collecting stories, because this is where we're going to talk about the Gilbert. But then again, we were deciding, wherever we are positioning it, it was having suddenly a really prominent position, where we thought that actually it was not quite right, and it was not it was not respecting the legacy of the Gilbert. I was over-interpreting. Then we thought, well, let's move it completely the opposite, where we're only focusing about the silver and the gold object, where we talk about its exquisite design and quality, because that's what Arthur bought it for. But then that means that we would deny the Jewish identity, and that was actually one of the evidence of Arthur and Rosalind, Jewish heritage. So we've actually, I'm going to ask you please not take any photo, because this is a roundup, our communication team at the V&A is not quite ready to share them publicly. So this is a render of our new galleries, and you're going to see the Torah crown here. So first of all, it's going to be on a mount, which is going to emulate a Torah scroll. So rather than being placed like this, as you can see here, just on a tiny plinth, where you don't really know what it relates to, it's finally going to be brought a little bit more into context. It's then going to be actually having its own prominent position in an archway in between two galleries. So that way we are saying it is one of the fascinating aspects of the Gilbert stories and identity, and it's complex, and that's why it deserves its own space. It's also between two galleries, where here we are talking about, as I explained, collectors, so the rimonim will be just there behind. And then on the other side, we are talking about provenance and Nazi looting and many other provenance cases that we've worked on. So it's in between those two galleries where we are naturally asking visitors to really reflect on, beyond the object, the stories that the object are bringing. And so there we are, really, alongside, as Elizabeth said, I've put together a public conference last year in November. I'm extremely lucky, to be supported by the director, who is very supportive of that,
We still don't have a Judaica acquisition policy. We're still not having a proper researcher or curator. But I believe that this is, for the moment, the best balance and the best way for the V&A to talk about the Jewish heritage and the Judaica object in the collection is by, small but impactful touches. Thank you.
Thank you for those wonderful presentations. I'm really eager to get to the discussion. I know we're running a little bit over time, so I'm just going to make very, very quick remarks about the Rothschild Pentateuch at the Getty, which is, as far as I know, our only object of Judaica in the entire museum, and sadly, we do not have vast collections like many other institutions. There's probably some photographs that relate, but otherwise I don't think I'm going to find any hidden gems, sadly. Our collection of manuscripts was formed in 1983 by Peter and Irene Ludwig of Aachen, Germany. They had 130 manuscripts. None of them were Hebrew manuscripts. It took us 35 years to remedy that oversight, despite having it as part of something we would like to add to the collection. Right now, it is a unicum. I have tried to make it very clear that it can't stay an orphan in the collection forever. But I do feel, I think it's arguably the most important Hebrew manuscript in the United States, which we're very proud of. And as far as I know, it is also the only illuminated medieval Hebrew manuscript west of the Mississippi. So it's a unicum and lonely, and it needs friends, hopefully, at some point. I just wanted to show it has hundreds of illuminated pages, which makes it wonderful for display, because we're very concerned about light in terms of the number of times we can show each page, but thankfully we have so many pages and so many different types of imagery in the manuscript that it suits many occasions. And we also have sort of an added bonus that even though the manuscript is from 1296, it has one illumination by Joel ben Simeon, so we can represent Italy slightly, of a slightly different era as well in the manuscript, which is wonderful. And then also we have the micrography, which is by a different scribe artist. And we, can show that as a sort of separate type of artwork as well. So just the wealth of the imagery in the Rothschild Pentateuch itself, just to give you a sense of how small the micrography is, that is a penny, and don't worry, I didn't put that on the actual manuscript. That is a photocopy that I used to show you the size. Since we've had the manuscript, it's been on display almost every single year in our gallery. We usually do 4 exhibitions a year, so we've been able to show it within context. Unfortunately, unlike some of my colleagues, we don't have the ability to show it with other Judaica, so it's always in context of the Middle Ages and with Christian manuscripts as well. So we show it in a number of different kinds of ways about religion, themes, prophecy. We showed sort of a Christian Old Testament next to it, graphic design, all these different ways. And as of today, it is on display. So this exhibition just opened today, and I would love for any of you to come visit the Getty to see our one object. And I just wanted to make a point that some of my colleagues have also made, and we can get to a little bit more in the discussion, about the difficulty of, because my department is devoted solely to manuscripts, so that's my only option. And these manuscripts come up infrequently because of, obviously, the vicissitudes of history. There are just not as many surviving Hebrew manuscripts. And then we have issues of provenance to consider as well as price. So one of my colleagues already showed the Shem Tov Bible, which came up in 2024, was sold for $6.96 million for 8 decorated text pages. And just for those of you who are not used to sort of these prices and thinking about it, from a collection that is European, which of course comprises the Jewish medieval experience, from the perspective of sort of the higher ups, higher than me, in terms of what you can collect for those kinds of prices. Just to give you some examples from recent sales, I could have, for example, gotten this fabulous manuscript at Christie's in 2021, which had 16 large miniatures, or this Book of Hours sold in France, which had 37 large miniatures, or this manuscript sold in 2020, the Almanac Hours, which had 38 miniatures and 400 border images. But it really brings it into perspective when I tell you that you could have gotten all 3 of these manuscripts for the cost of one Hebrew manuscript with 8 decorated text pages. So it is from the perspective of me, and I'm very eager to discuss other museums, it's hard for me to convince the higher ups to spend that kind of money on one object like that, rather than the sort of bulk of our collection, which is built on manuscripts like this. So now I will join my compatriots. Take this off the screen. So, lovely colleagues. I know that we're a little bit short on time, and so I was going to start with a softball question about why we collect and display Judaica, but I think we all know why we want to collect and display Judaica, so I'm going to hop right in. And I know each of you touched about this a little bit in your talks, but I think it's a really good question from the museum professional perspective, talking a bit about how the collecting of Judaica in your institution is based on personal curatorial vision or is based on institutional priority. For instance, in my institution, I think it very well might be that we still have no Hebrew manuscript in the collection. I pressed, it took me 6.5 years to acquire the Rothschild Pentateuch. So, you know, because it was such a big acquisition. And for me personally, I think that, you know, 100 years from now, when there's another fabulous conference like this, I would like for someone to say, that's the most amazing thing Elizabeth Morrison did, is that she started the Judaica collection at the Getty. But I'm just interested, what are your experiences and how, you know, for me, I feel like it's always a little bit of a fight because it's not ever mentioned in any institutional policy at all. How does that influence the way you're able to collect and display your objects?
Yeah, please. So in the case of the MFA, so it's not clear-cut, so clear-cut division of whether it's an institutional priority or a curator. It started when I showed you the very first intentional purchase, the Hanukkah lamp from Germany. That was a curatorial vision. The curator said we need one great example of Judaica, and that was done. And then sometimes there is chance. Chance happens. You meet a donor who can help you in something, but also has, not me, but years ago, a Judaica collection, and she speaks to you, and the curators first, and then the institution start to think maybe. I cannot say that the MFA, I think the MFA as an institution came later in the idea and the vision of Judaica. It was first curatorial with intervention from donors. Yeah.
I mean, that's why I explained the Judaica initiative. I mean, that is a direct conversation. I think our wish is that it becomes institutional, but
you mentioned Luke Sison. What was his? How did that come about? As like him saying, "Yes, let's do this."
The abbreviated part of that, it was a larger conversation that happened, but effectively it was there's a blind spot within our collection. We have these sort of sleeper objects that were not known as Judaica, and then there was nothing really significant that spoke to within the, you can't speak to European sculpture, decorative arts experience and then not say, well, where's the Jewish history within that, if it's a community of diaspora? So where are those Jewish conversations? So it came out of a conversation that was really alongside medieval. So those are the two really spearheaded departments, medieval and ESDA. And yeah, I mean, it was Luke who really sort of acquired those finials and the crown, and then, but it's still really an ESDA-driven focus. We are the only one with a Judaica initiative. On occasion, you have conversations with colleagues in other departments, but it's really just us thinking about it, and I think the hope is that it would become an institutional focus, but if there's more than, 10 departments, at least 17 departments, and everyone has their own acquisition wish list and what they're hoping to achieve and what they're hoping to do, then it's not going to be consistent, but I think there's a lot of conversation that is very positive, and it could be great for the next 150 years of the institution. So I think that's what we hope, but it's really just ESDA at the moment.
I'm a bit like you, Elizabeth. I think that, in 150 years from now, I wish someone will say, oh, you remember Alice? Well, she was quite, I know about, Jewish heritage somehow, but to make it recognized and institutionalized at the V&A, I was really inspired by your webpage, when you say that you got a Judaica. And the V&A, because we're an encyclopedic museum, has got so many different facets of heritage. But I think that this is what our visitors really want now, is the story behind the object. And if we are bringing that to the forefront, start with Judaica and then other type of heritage, I think that's the need for our visitor, and I wish that progressively we can make that institutionalized. I don't think, realistically, I'm not, aiming for acquisition, at least if, because I think we only have probably about 15% on display. So if at least, the rest of the collection was properly catalogued, acknowledged, and there is like some event around it, handling session, discussion, someone that, when you've got like a handover to the next generation, there is always someone interested enough and allowed to have the time to continue getting onto those research. I think that would be my dream. That's where I would love to be. And in hopefully before 150 years time, like in 40 years being like, this is not institutionalized. There will be always a bit of a carving for looking at Jewish heritage in all its forms.
Yeah. It was interesting what you were saying, Simona, because one of the things that was important for us in acquiring the Rothschild Pentateuch is that there was institutional buy-in, that we needed this object to be able to contextualize the medieval experience, but it is a little bit about what you're talking about, like mission accomplished, kind of done, and it's up to us to kind of, make sure that it's not done, that it continues to be used, and we were very grateful that Joe and Ronald Lauder donated a significant amount of money to enable us to acquire this object, and I think we are all very grateful to all of our donors for being that possible. But it leads me to my next question, which is, and I think we've seen this throughout the conference here, with people showing different levels of work in the Judaica, and I'm just wondering if any of you have had sort of conversations with management about acquisitions or display around the issue of quality. That this idea of like, we're museums, so we can't, we have to have a certain level of quality in the galleries, and if we put this object in, it won't match the quality of the other, often Christian artworks. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
We have, and it's a painful memory. Because the Montefiore Mahzor, that many of you know, and it's now, they're so lucky in Houston, in their Judaica gallery, was that moment. And this is where I'm conflating quality with condition, physical condition. If you compare it to a Christian manuscript, would you buy a Christian manuscript if most of the pages had been torn out? Mm-hmm. So when I went to look at the Montefiore Mahzor and wept because of its beauty and because of its tragedy and its story, then you go back to the museum, and that's the moment when the issue of physical condition, quality within the typical standard of the Museum of Fine Arts comes in. And there are other moments like that. So yes, I come across the issue of quality and physical condition quite a bit. And I also want to shake things up. I on purpose in my various collages, I didn't show you our major acquisitions, most expensive synagogue Judaica. I've showed you some work on paper, some folk art, because I want to debunk, the hierarchy for Judaica too. So,
Yeah, we have this conversation all the time. It has to be Met quality. We won't acquire something, like the Jewish Museum in New York has that lovely, we kind of work together where they can acquire as a representation of Jewish heritage. And they can acquire a spice box that's might not be perfect, but it's a representative of a touchstone with an aspect of Jewish life and culture, even though it might not be perfect. So we do have that conversation fairly often where one of the things that we work on is that we have to acquire at that level. Again, to your point, to speak to, if it's in the room with a Farnese table, we're going to put a beautiful piece of Judaica with it. While there obviously is a counter argument to that, I can't be as bold as Simona, but I think we still try to tap into a range of objects that still speak to a varied experience. Maybe it's German, maybe it's Italian, maybe we focus on the geographical differences, but we still have to compete for that quality conversation. But we're very lucky. We have many collections of Judaica that we can speak to and work with that can speak to the conversations that we personally can't have in our galleries, but maybe through dialogue and other ways. But we have to have a certain standard, you could say.
The V&A, well, I'm lucky because for the Gilbert collection, we've got that pair of Rimonem, and then the Torek one, which is one of the only two in the world made of pure gold. So in terms of quality, we are reaching that level. So it's like the conversation didn't happen. And I think, if we were ever to redisplay our little Judaica corner, I think actually we're pretty lucky at the V&A because the role, the value of the V&A is to really, again, tell those stories. And we are not necessarily aiming for, condition is important, so that visitor can see it, but not necessarily the quality as long as the story behind is important. So I think we are already in a good place.
And my next question, and some of you have touched on this a little bit, how have Jewish and non-Jewish audiences responded to Judaica in the galleries? And is that based on anecdotal observations or more formal surveys?
Well, I can answer that one first because I've I've done that survey, but actually it's interesting. I'm not Jewish, and that's probably, you can tell, my lack of detail and specialism on the subject, and I'm learning absolutely every day. It's very interesting because two of our trustees who grew up, were trained and taught by Arthur Gilbert are Jewish, and I've proposed for the first time ever an acquisition for the Gilbert Galleries of, I don't know if you saw it, it was at Christie's, it was earlier this year, and there was a very interesting kiddies cup that was coming from a 13th century unearthed treasure. And I thought, that's actually very, very interesting. And I had suggested that and another, say, I can't remember, 18th century sort in the same cell. And I thought, surely they would be appealed by, the Kiddush cup. And then they responded, say like, I like the 18th century European. I was like, how is that interesting? And I think for the moment, because I'm not Jewish, I think that has facilitated our conversation at the V&A with the public to say, we are here to look at the history and reach wider audiences, rather than possibly thinking, I've got a personal agenda here because it resonates with my heritage. Right now, I'm just talking about the V&A, and I know that the way we placed the conference in November 2025, exactly a year after the 7th of October, probably helped us carrying on and having this public conference. So yes, and as we said, with the audience's consultation, and we were quite surprised. So yeah. I mean, we have tours that exist for our audiences called Spirituality and Art Tour, and it's intended that it includes all forms of spirituality. We no longer have a Jewish ritual art tour for a variety of reasons, but I think we hope, and I think part of the curatorial intention of placing Judaica in our gallery spaces, we're forcing our visitors to engage subconsciously, maybe they're thinking about it, on whatever level they're coming to our galleries, by displaying our objects across our galleries. It does enhance, our visitorship. I think the fact that we have a Temple of Solomon model, that every type of denomination who is on some sort of religious tour within the museum, because there's many even external tours, there's always a crowd around it. So I think because our curatorial intention is to disperse our objects, everyone has to interact with them on every level. Whether there are more personalized objectives, sure. Do we have visitors that are only looking for Judaica, and that's an ongoing conversation of why don't you have a Judaica gallery, and why is it here, and we can't find it? But again, I think we're always trying to expand on what we do at the Met, which is telling creative stories of communities and artisans, and if it's Judaica, wonderful, and if you engage with that, great. But in terms of really who's interested in what, we can't really sort of say, but we have a variety of tours that our education department tries to really engage with all aspects of the public to speak to those stories, whether it's a pop-up tour for the high holidays or Passover or Hanukkah. I mean, it's a really diverse range of individuals. So, I don't know if that answers it, but I think it's an interesting way to sort of see how we are thinking about our own objects of Judaica, and I think it's important to also educate your audience to say, well, it's not just a Hanukkah lamp that was made by someone who's confined to a ghetto. Well, maybe that individual had a relationship with an artisan, maybe they were a patron of a certain status, and then the story comes out that the Jewish lived experience is so multifaceted that it starts to grow arms and legs within the department, within the collection. So I think we tap into a pretty wide range of audienceship without overly focusing on one specific mission. But internally, this is our mission of creating more Judaica acquisitions and programming. So
So going to whether the response by the public is being received through a formal survey that we've only just launched for the Judaica Gallery through a QR code a couple of weeks ago. I haven't seen the results yet, but I constantly get feedback. And your question opens a whole cultural discussion that we can have in another venue of the cultural history of the Jews in that specific country and in that specific city. I'm a Roman Jew, tiny Jewish community compared to Boston, and yet the visibility of Jewishness in Rome is greater through an important historic Jewish museum, restaurants. In Boston, that disappears, and that is reflected, I learned in my 7 years in the US and in Boston, in the museum, because often I find that, for example, our donor who donated a whole collection is not from Boston, it's from Tulsa. Other people who have been involved and interested in helping are not from Boston. So these questions go right at the heart about how the Jews of that city feel about their Jewishness.
Yeah.
Keep it on the lowdown, don't be noticed, don't make a fuss, to think that New York Jewish community is from the 1650s and Boston from the late 19th century. It's a city with a history of racism, anti-Semitism, segregation, and I think that affected unconsciously our Jewish community, and I feel it as a museum curator who wants to shout, hey, these objects are Jewish and they have wonderful Jewish stories. And so you have to navigate how people feel about it with your own very different background and identity, and thoughts about how Jewish material and art should be presented and the fact that it should be presented. So I know I've opened a much greater discussion, but it does have to do with Jewish identity.
Yeah, I agree. One of the interesting things is, for those of you who've not been to Los Angeles and the Getty is located in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's huge surrounding areas that are uninhabited at all. And the three closest institutions to the Getty are the synagogue across the street, the Skirball Center for Jewish Culture, which is up the road a little bit, and the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is just across the highway. So one of the things when we acquired the Rothschild Pentateuch, I reached out to the directors and staffs of those institutions before we announced publicly the acquisition of this and offered for them to have special tours to come up and see the object. And it was really interesting that those three institutions had very different reactions and feelings of connection to the object. So, but it is wonderful every time we have it in the gallery. I always see people in there reading aloud from it in Hebrew, which is amazing because nobody does that with our Latin Christian manuscripts. I can tell you that.
Same with ours.
Yeah. So I know that we're over time. I'm going to have a lightning round fun question here at the end, which is, don't think about provenance, don't think about cost. If you could add one object to your collections as your next acquisition, what would it be and why? And I'll just start by saying, because I have one thing, the next thing that I would like is a late medieval, either Sephardic or Italian Haggadah, because it's a different kind of book, it's a different location, it's a different time period. So that's what's in my heart of hearts.
Oh God, that's actually a very difficult question. Any item of domestic Judaica. I would love an etrog box. I would love a scroll. You know, anything that brings a Kiddush cup would be wonderful. But it's a long list of wishes. So it's a terrible answer to your question, but it's a long wish list.
Can we trade one of my Kiddush cups with your Mishneh Torah? So, okay, if the Mishneh Torah is not available, something that sold into my pain in 2018, the Shock and Matzor. I'd love that one. So if it comes back, well, we cannot afford it, but you know, it's on the level of dreaming. So.
Right. Well, definitely the Kiddush cup that I was hoping to acquire earlier this year, you know, unearthed from the 13th century. I thought that was, you know...
Which one is that?
It was a Kiddush cup that was at Christie's. It was the Zika collection in New York. And that was actually their lot number 1, I think.
Yeah.
And that is something that I wanted because precisely all the Judaica that we have is mainly about the 18th and 19th centuries. There's nothing that brings you back. But being in Britain, you know, anything, actually the Ashmolean has got quite a lot of few early pieces. If I could get one early pieces like this for the V&A, it would be fabulous.
So now it's all of your jobs to keep your eyes open and go out and fundraise to help us do our jobs, which is our favorite part is buying stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for that really fascinating insight into the problems and priorities of acquisition and display, and I'm sure we all would like to continue to this discussion today and into the future. Now, we are running a little bit over time, but as a close to today, we have Alina Gertzman, who is going to give a response and reflection on the themes in this symposium. So it's my pleasure to introduce her. Alina Gertzman is the Distinguished University Professor of Medieval Art and Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities in the Department of Art History and Art at Case Western Reserve University. In addition to numerous articles, she has authored several award-winning monographs, including most recently The Absent Image, Lacunae in Medieval Books, which was winner of the Charles Rufus Maury Prize and the Otto Grundler Prize. She is currently working on several book-length projects, including one on the materiality of medieval medium, and another thermorphic imagery in Hebrew manuscripts. In 2022, she was elected a Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America. So please welcome her.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you for sort of sticking around. I will try to be very fast. I actually kept adding and cutting things, and I was going to cut something, but then Simona's remarks made me want to put it back. So I'm going to start by thanking once again Laura and Reed for this extraordinary symposium. I cannot tell you how proud I am of you and how delighted I am to have supported you in this. So as I said, I kept writing and rewriting things. So please bear with me. I knew it would be so amazingly rich. I didn't know just how rich. So I was particularly delighted to see the speakers engage with the symposium's brief, which was inherent in its very title, in the latest iteration of the title, right? To trace the long lives, rather than afterlives, which I realize is on the second page, but really the long lives of medieval Jewish objects. Because an afterlife implies a break, right? A caesura of sorts, which is frequently the way that these objects are discussed, often in terms of outside forces, often in terms of malignant actors that brought on such a break. Long life implies continuity, marked, of course, both by catastrophic and joyful events, but a continuity nevertheless, a vibrant, unbroken life which opens up a multitude of Jewish histories, deeply enmeshed in the narrative network of the world. It is a life, more often than not, as we have seen, on the move. It is a mutable life, the one whose predicate is the nearly assured migration and rebuilding. A life that carries both objects and people and to place to place, from Ashkenaz to Italy, from Sfarad to the Holy Land, from the Alps to Ireland and well beyond. A life that necessitates tremendous detective work to trace the peregrinations, say, of a 13th century Latin Hebrew psalter or the 11th century dedicatory synagogue inscription. We have seen how these long lives play across micro-histories. The Darmstadt Haggadah and its several moves, both enforced and attempted, open up questions about cultural indeterminacy, vulnerable in the hands of those who wield power and who define, in the end, what this culture is. Is it Jewish? Is it German? Is it both? Or to Alice's point, is it British? Is it exotic? Is it foreign? And what the object stands for. A testament, again, back to Darmstadt Haggadah, to a nearly destroyed population to be enshrined in the library. A testament to that population's continued existence in need of a functional liturgical book. A testament to the Nazi desecrations, an artifact valued for its cover at the expense of its visual and textual substance. A testament to that population's diasporic exodus across the Atlantic, and therefore an object of profound social rather than visual importance. What makes such an object? The leather cover of the Darmstadt Haggadah, made perhaps, as William told us, by the son of the manuscript scribe, became a fraught site of cultural tensions of a different sort seen, for example, than when Islamic books in Christian Iberia are bound by perhaps Jewish craftsmen. What, after all, constitutes a cultural artifact that belongs to that culture in those libraries and in those archives? We have seen also how these long lives play across collecting practices. Our fabulous panelists gave us fantastic insight into issues of acquisition and display in major collections. I won't repeat their insights except to highlight, I think, the question of silences. Silences in collecting, silences in display, silences in public response, counterbalanced by curatorial intention or vision,
whether it concerns the discovery of the sleepers, or active acquisition strategies, or the possible reconsideration of previous strategies that privileged, what was it, Alice, excellence in making and design and not origin, or rejection of the often infuriating conversations about quality, or what, in the case of my museum, constitutes art. What about those manuscripts that end up in the hands of private collectors? Here, still different long histories are being written, also marked by silences, ones deeply enmeshed and clearly stamped by those who shepherd these collections and those to whom these collections cater. The handling of a certain assembly of Hebrew manuscripts in the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, which I only knew as the Kaufman Collection, and which is referred by its librarians solely as the Kaufman Collection, stands witness not just to the social mores of the 19th century, ranging from appalling practices reflective of gender disparities to the juicy and distasteful gossip that fed them, and we see this in the margins of this website, and I chose to crop it out. Writing the collection's history, which was a really fabulous, impassioned plea, allows us to resurrect Irma Kaufman and Rosa Gompers as seminal forces in its formation, a much-needed corrective to the present state of affairs. The long lives of some of these objects, as we see emerging from these sessions, were instilled into these objects ab ovo. Maimonides, of course, wished for his manuscripts to be read across temporal and geographical expanses. The Mishneh Torah, about which we heard, is an excellent example of the importance of the long view, in which the creation of the manuscript proper in the 15th century Italy is but a single coordinate point on the extended axis that encompasses what we may term a prehistory of nearly 300 years, during which time the text of the Sephardic rabbi, which was commented on and copied and commented on again by Ashkenazic scholars, and which continues, not ends, through the shared acquisition of the manuscript by the Israel Museum and the Met. The lacuna of nearly 400 years, as we have seen time and again, is a typical one. The movement of the manuscripts from Jewish owners into the hands of academic or Christian institutions, whether the objects eventually become available, again, to their communities, or, as in the case of a famous 3-volume Tanakh, now in the collections of Ambrosiana. This history is very rarely sufficiently documented. Why that is so can be gleaned from the way the long lives of objects play across questions of display, raising questions about ethics, social memory, and cultural perception of what constitutes an accepted rhetoric of exhibition that sees a sharp divide between one's own culture and that of those still considered the other. The Sicilian Rimonim may have shared their visual language with Christian Bourdon, but their appropriation and what Philippe Buc would call conversion, wherein the reconfigured artifacts are left to bear emphatic witness to their original morphology, as in the spice container converted into a reliquary or a Rimonim converted into Bourdon, belies a purposeful, socially charged, and targeted use. Here perhaps is the moment when we're invited to look precisely at afterlives, as we saw in the case of Basel tombstones, now displayed as sculptures inside a museum courtyard. Tombstones, restored or in an excellent state of preservation, are made into objets d'art that elide a violent history of post-14th century Basel, which is nevertheless borne out by the traces of purposeful damage inflicted upon them. Those in worse conditions that have been used and reused, at times, as we were shocked to learn, as part of the canalization system of the city, reduced into stone supports of sewage systems, or placed face down in the cloister floors. What a contrast then with the Bochum synagogue reuse, which tapped into historicizing and mythologizing valence of spolia to foreground loss and remembrance, belonging and sanctity. Reuse which brought these stones to life through the power of lore and genealogy of self-aware salvage. A conference on the long lives of objects raises more questions than it can answer. Images, and I will just finish by showing you something that most of you will know very well, but I think is quite telling. Images in the 14th century Magzor contain countless erasures, additions, and emendations, including one nearly fully overpainted miniature covered with broad swaths of red paint. Revisions are particularly evident in its human figures, which, with few notable exceptions, as you see here, possess anthropomorphic but schematic faces, eyes with arched eyebrows and with rudimentary noses and mouths. Several of those were later corrected, enriched with more complete features, particularly eyes. On this folio, two matzah bakers have been so transformed. The one in front received a fully drawn eyeball, complete with the iris. The one in the back got two small pinpricks instead. These two figures, who hold ceremonial accoutrements for Sukkot, have apparently looked much like other figures in the manuscript, with their eyebrows dipping down to their noses. Here, eyes were added to their nearly featureless heads, the user methodically filling the gaping spaces under their eyebrows. And yet, some of these additions did not sit easily with yet a subsequent reader who tried to scrub them out. Similarly, in this scene of binding of Isaac, both Abraham and his son, as well as the intervening angel and Abraham's servant, received almond-shaped eyes, some of which were later partially rubbed away. The original lack, the subsequent addition, and the present subtraction turned the image into an alchemical pot of sorts, a performance, a process art before its time, an exercise in inviting and fighting representability, in embracing and rejecting the power of images. And if liking useful paratexts of the kind we find present in that gorgeous Bible that Javier told us about, we can't offer definitive answers on when and where and by whom these images were revised, and why revisions were so selective. We can raise questions about the ontological, theological, and experiential variety of these alterations, the palpable angst, or perhaps the visual declarations of every subsequent viewer, itself a visual paratext that proclaim, if nothing else, struggles with the limits of representation, with erasures both conceptual and tangible, mediating between the readers and their books. These mediations, then, allow us to grasp, or at least to contemplate, the organic, mutable response that the manuscript's images elicited in their beholders, transforming the book into a palimpsest of visual practices that unfurls in the active modes of the manuscript's reception. The long lives of objects are fraught and intellectually difficult, riddled as they are with lacunae. But lacunae do not mean interruption. They are instead productive sites of inference, and they are witnesses, above all, to ever-changing cultural practices that treat images as playthings, tossed around, loved, hated, discarded, picked up anew, and now teased out and interrogated in conferences and symposia on medieval Jewish art and its rich and complicated and very long lives, brought into such high relief by our extraordinary speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alina, for these wonderful remarks, and thank you to all of our speakers, all of our volunteers for making these 2 days absolutely incredible and so intellectually enriching. I just want to thank again as well all of our sponsors, Sam Fogg, Mellon Foundation, Case Western, the Medieval Academy, and the Courtauld. I also want to take this moment to really shout out Laura Feigen, my co-organizer, and how wonderful it's been to work with her on this project for multiple years. So thank you all so much. Last remark, all of our speakers, don't run off. We want to get a photo. But thank you all so much for attending Tracing Jewish Histories.